Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku took a swan dive and was replaced? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. In almost every mirror world, Midoriya Izuku ends up someone to take note of. Most of the time, he becomes a hero, the inheritor of One for All, and the successor to All Might's legacy. Sometimes, he becomes a villain, and his analytical skills prove to be a formidable asset. Sometimes, he gains power through means other than quirks, whether that be a freak accident, advanced support equipment, or even other dimensions. In this fragment of the mirror, however, Midoriya Izuku lies in an alleyway, bones broken after taking a swan dive off a rooftop, dying alone amidst the pittering and pattering of raindrops. He somewhat expected bleeding out from blunt force trauma to be a more painful and terrifying experience, but maybe that was just the shock numbing it all. Even so, he couldn't help but feel oddly relieved to reduce the quirkless burden on society. Maybe Kaken was right, and he'd get a quirk in his next life to be a proper hero with. And this way, All Might wouldn't have to worry about his secret getting out. But if he were to have one regret, that I should have said goodbye to Mom. Perhaps Auntie and Uncle Katsuki would keep her company. And so, Izuku let his eyes drift shut as his consciousness faded to black. Hello. The boy weakly opened his eyes again, barely able to see the source of the voice given his neck was broken. Something shuffled around in the sewer grate beside him, breathing heavily as it watched him. Hello. The thing asked again. Hi. There was a pause before a different voice came out of the sewer. What's your name? Izuku. Izuku. He heard his own voice parrot back, and out of habit, his mind immediately went to thinking about the applications of a voice mimicry quirk. Should he have been talking to this thing in the sewers that he couldn't even properly see? Probably not, but some company in his last moments probably wouldn't hurt. Well, not any more than he should be hurting right now. You probably can't, but if you find a person called Inko Midoriya, can you tell her I'm sorry? For taking a swan dive, to have a quirk, in my next life? Once again, his own voice came from the sewer grate. Inko Midoriya? Izuku's vision blurred as he felt everything fading. Thank you for listening. The last thing Izuku heard was the sound of metal clattering, and something breathing over him. Inko Midoriya paced around her living room, rubbing her hands together worriedly. Izuku should have been back hours ago, and the pouring rain wasn't helping. She had already called the police, but if they didn't find him today, his quirklessness meant no one would try again. The second her doorbell rang, Inko immediately rushed to the door and let out a cry of relief as she saw two police officers and her son. The bandages on her baby boy and the impassive frown on his face were a less comforting sight, but at least he was home. We found him wandering the streets alone with a number of cuts and bruises, Miss Midoriya. The officer reported. It's likely he was attacked by a villain, though he seems incapable of providing a description. We treated him at the station, and heroes will be patrolling the area to catch the one responsible. Have a good night, ma'am. Thank you, thank you. Inko sobbed at the thought that Izuku could very well have not returned today, as she pulled her son into a hug, noticing that he wasn't reciprocating it like he usually would. As the police left, Inko wiped her eyes with her sleeves and walked towards the kitchen to warm up Izuku's dinner, though the boy simply stood at the door motionlessly, instead looking around. Just give me a second to get dinner warmed up, you must be starving. Are you, Inko Midoriya? Inko froze, and turned around slowly to see Izuku tilting his head curiously, staring at her with eyes that were all too blank to be natural to her normally energetic and passionate son. The way he spoke was wrong, the intonations and tone off. The only thing that was right was the way he said her name, and Izuku never referred to her that way. Izuku? What? Are you my mom? Oh, of course I am. Inko found herself backing off out of instinctual fear as she noticed more and more errors in what should have been her son. His voice was wrong, his behavior was wrong, his expression was wrong. He was a few inches taller in relation to the door and couch than she remembered, his body slightly off balance. What happened? Uncertain. Inko felt her legs give out, collapsing against the fridge as she heard her son's voice, which would have been almost perfect this time if given the context that he was out of breath. Even then, it was like multiple sentences spliced together, and she felt like she was watching a recording of something she wouldn't want to know about. For taking a swan dive to have a quirk in my next life. I should have said goodbye. Inko choked back a sob as she looked at the thing that was certainly not her son standing in the living room, as she asked the one question she had to ask. Who are you? The thing paused, before it started speaking in a cacophony of voices, each one clearly not its own. Hello. I love you. Help. Someone help. How may I help you? You have received a voicemail. Is anyone to answer? Anyone there? Then, Ku. Thank you. Thank you. Cool. Manager. Inko balled up in fear, a river of tears rolling down her face as she heard the thing draw closer. Her son was dead, and she was locked in, completely powerless and alone. She felt a pair of arms wrap around her. It was too firm, too forced to be a proper hug, but it was clearly an attempt, a mimicry of her previous gesture. The thing spoke again, its voice like something filtered through a recording. Just like how we observe abnormalities as employees, nothing there observes us. Then it puts on the shell of an employee and thinks of itself as the employee that just died. The two were there for what felt like hours, the silence punctuated by Inko Midoriya's sobbing, all while the thing that wore her son's skin stayed there motionlessly, providing the only embrace she would ever feel from her son again. Nothing there, that's your name? Yes, the thing replied, as if drawing each word from a prior experience. Inko gently pushed Nothing There's arms away, looking the shell of her son in the eyes. Everything she knew told her that she was being stupid, that she should be bolting out of the house screaming at the top of her lungs, that she should be on the floor, mourning her loss, that she should be demanding that this thing return her son to her. But the fact this thing hadn't killed her meant that its words were plausible, that Izuku had taken his own life because of his quirklessness. I don't want to let him go, she shouldn't. She couldn't. As a mother, to make this request would be against every moral she knew. Can you be my baby boy, my Izu, just for a while? Nothing there watched as Inko broke down in tears, unable to hold back after everything, a silent observer to her misery. Days after the slime villain incident, Bakugo Katsuki walked into his classroom at Aldra Junior High with his usual scowl. The heroes had taken 2 DM long to rescue him from that pile of sludge, resulting in him having to stay in the hospital. On the bright side though, his hag of a mom didn't scream at him for his attitude for those few days, and the media coverage would be helpful for when he debuted as a hero. Sitting down at his seat, the blonde immediately noticed something wrong. Izuku's seat was empty. Oi, where's Deku? He yelled loudly, not caring of whether or not the teacher cared because they never did. There were murmurs around the class at the fact that Izuku apparently hadn't been back in the last few days, and no one had noticed. The teacher cleared his throat to silence the chattering, before turning to speak with Bakugo. A few days ago, the day immediately after you were attacked by the slime villain in fact, Miss Inko Midoriya told us that her son was being withdrawn immediately for an undisclosed medical reason. Bakugo felt his blood boil as he clenched his fist. Deku was probably trying to steal his attention by causing a fuss with his withdrawal. Well, too bad for him, no one seemed to care. That being said, it was odd that Auntie Inko would go along with something like that. But it's not like the nerd died or anything, so who cares? Inko sat at the dinner table with a mug of coffee, groaning to herself as she massaged her face, wrinkled from yet another tearful night. Nothing there, or Izuku now, was currently in her son's room watching as many videos from the past as she could dreadfully dredge up, growing more convincing in its mimicry each day. It didn't need to eat, it didn't need to sleep, and occasionally, she heard it straighten itself out, redistributing mass with horrific squelching sounds. This was not made better by it telling her that her son's bones had been pulverized by the pavement before it donned his skin as a shell, hence the lack of cracking noises. The only consolation was that it acted like a child at times, a child that learned at a ridiculous pace, sure, but still a child, enough for her to plausibly believe that Izuku had just lost his memory and finally gained a quirk like he had always wanted, even if that quirk was the grotesque ability to shift his flesh around like clay. Speak of the devil, Inko thought as Izuku walked into the living room, giving her a wave from the doorway. Its speech was still slow, but the intonation and pronunciation was getting more accurate at least. Good morning, Izuku. She noticed that Izuku was gripping something in his hand, something red and blue and yellow. As the substitute for her son deposited it on the table, she held back a curse as she laid her eyes on Izuku's beloved All Might figure. What's this? Who's this? That's All Might. Inko gently picked up the figure, remembering the ways that Izuku would present it to her in clarity that she didn't want. Izuku's favorite hero. Hero. They're complicated. With great reluctance, Inko pried open the shelf that Izuku's movies were held in, picking his old favorites to play on the television. Izuku walked over and sat on the sofa in a way that seemed oddly forced, while Inko sat on the opposite end as the program began. Izuku wanted to be a hero more than anything. Inko whispered, unable to raise her voice any higher without causing herself to enter another round of sobbing. He wanted to go to Yue, of all places, no matter what everyone else told him. Why did he give up? Nothing there didn't respond, borrowed eyes glued to the screen as it was finally exposed to heroes, to those that Izuku wanted to be so badly. When the last movie ended, the moon had risen long ago, yet Izuku hadn't moved a single inch, recording each and every scene in his inhuman memory. Inko was sitting alone at the dinner table, occasionally glancing at the monster in human skin to see if it was done yet. All of a sudden, Izuku turned to look at her, causing her to drop her spoon in surprise. Heroes are interesting. They are, aren't they? There was so much to see out there. So much to learn. So many different things that humans enjoyed. So many things that nothing there would never get to experience if it laid low and lived an ordinary life. I think I want to try being a hero. Sitting on top of a fridge in the early morning, All Might sported his signature grin as he watched his chosen successor slowly pull his ride along the trash-covered sands of Dagoba Beach. Not bad, young Kirishima. He applauded the boy, who collapsed in tired yet proud breaths in front of All Might's truck. At this rate, you'll be a ready vessel for my quirk in no time. To do my best. A still black-haired Ijiro gave his mentor a thumbs up before shooting a glare at the garbage on the beach. It's still hard to believe that this beach became a dump. Talk about unmanly behavior. That it is. All Might laughed, before seeing a familiar mop of green hair walking by the beach. Oh, is that? The woman holding Izuku's hand, likely his mother given their similar appearances, gasped at the sight of the number one himself. All Might. The exclamation drew Izuku's attention, and All Might was instantly confused. That wasn't the boy who was so excited to meet a hero that he had clung to his pants leg. He lacked the energy that he displayed that day, his gaze more controlled. Perhaps that was just how he acted with his mother. People did show different sides of themselves to others, after all. What a coincidence, young Midoriya. All Might beamed as he walked over to the duo, his hulking figure blocking out the sun. What brings you by this beach? We were heading to the doctor's. His mother answered, and he noticed her hand tighten around Izuku's, trembling almost imperceptibly. She was uneasy for some reason. His quirk came in just a few days ago, so we're going to have it registered. Why, that's wonderful. What luck. He directed his beaming grin down upon Izuku, trying to see if he could find any trace of the boy he saw that day. Now you can be a hero like you've always wanted. Always. He heard Izuku's mother whisper as her grip tightened. Izuku simply stared upwards with an odd stare that reminded him far too much of Nizu, the type that dissected every part of you, from behavior to personality to physique. He'd seen the boy's notebook when signing it, and it was a masterpiece of analytical work, but this felt more predatory than those observations. I'm going to you, Izuku said in a rather flat manner, almost as if out of obligation rather than passion. I want to be a hero. Like you. Huh, best of luck to you then. Excuse me, All Might, his mother cut in. When did you meet Izuku? It was a few days ago, madam. I must say, your son is quite the passionate youth. Inko is fine. Things kept getting odder and odder. What used to be an almost reverent woman now seemed on edge, her other hand fidgeting with her dress. Please, tell me what happened between you and Izuku. All Might decided to omit the whole, your son had to be saved from a sludge villain, and then grabbed on my pants leg and found out my secret part. We happened to meet by circumstance. He told me all about how much he looked up to me, and that he wanted to be a hero. An admirable dream, given his passion and well-meaning personality. What was your response? Now it was like she was testing the waters for something she was forcing herself to look for. Well, All Might looked over at the boy beside him for a moment, who was currently looking out at the beach, before leaning in to whisper to Inko. It is certainly good for him to have dreams, but I simply couldn't endorse him to risk his life without a quirk. That would be irresponsible of me. A policeman would have been an equally respectable job, and far more achievable, realistically speaking. But now that he has a quirk, I can see him becoming a promising hero. All Might had expected the woman to be pleased at the fact that he, the #1 hero, had acknowledged her child's promise as a hero, but he was instead given a full-screen, 4K HD view of the look of absolute dread that had come across her face. Inko immediately bowed. Thank you for your kind words, All Might, but we have to go now or we'll be late to his appointment. Before walking away with Izuku with haste, the boy waved at Ijiro as he left, and as the two walked away, All Might heard a snippet of a monologue from Izuku. We were all abandoned, sis. But we all had dreams too. Remember? Well, let's make our dreams come true. Let's sink together into the depths. Izuku, you can't say things like that in public. All Might allowed himself a frown as he walked back to his successor. Why was the pair acting so odd, especially when comparing Izuku to the boy he saw that day? Why did it seem like the boy was a different person? Or rather, why did he not feel like a person at all? Like he was simply the concept of a person, and nothing else was there? Unbelievable! Dr. Tsubasa exclaimed as he went through every note he had on the anomaly that was Izuku Midoriya. The X-rays couldn't even penetrate the skin between his fingers. What does that mean, doctor? Inko asked, and the doctor massaged his temples as he thought over the implications of the results. Your son, after manifesting his quirk after years of being diagnosed quirkless, toe joint and all, now has a quirk that has given him the ability to mimic voices, increased his physical strength by multiple factors given the physical examinations, and may even bear other properties given the results of the X-rays. Tsubasa threw his arms up. It's simply unheard of. With a sigh, he rolled over to his computer and opened up Izuku's file. Still, it's a clear sign that he's manifested a quirk, so I'll perform the necessary updates. What will you name it, by the way? Izuku simply sat there, completely impassive, before speaking in Tsubasa's voice, having copied it earlier. Mimicry. Izuku, can you go back to your own voice, please? Inko pleaded, seeing the doctor's discomfort. Okay, Mom. Inko let out a sigh on the way home. Somehow, everything had gone fine. Izuku didn't out himself as an abomination wearing her son's skin, not that even she knew what he looked like under that shell, as he called it, and they'd registered it as a quirk, so no one would ask intrusive questions about it. As they passed by the beach again, she noticed All Might was still there, overseeing a boy as he cleared trash off the beach. Given he seemed eager to do it, she decided it was probably him providing encouragement. He turned to beam at her again, but she immediately took a turn away from the beach, because for everything All Might had done for Japan, she couldn't look at him the same way anymore. Not when he might have been the reason her son was dead. The two met days ago, not more than a week, and they had discussed Izuku's ability to be a hero, to which All Might had told him to be realistic and give up on it. Even if she understood the reasoning, and that it was well-intentioned, All Might had been Izuku's idol. To tell him such a thing would have crushed him. That, combined with the bullying that Izuku had never told her about, which was evident from the bruises and burns that he sported whenever he came back from school. Inko resisted the urge to throw up as she pressed a hand against a wall to calm herself. Is something wrong, Mom? She heard Izuku ask with a fragment of what sounded like concern. She took a deep breath, before flashing him a weak smile and continuing the walk home. I'm fine, Izuku, just fine. Okay. Since there's a few more months until the UA entrance exam, I'll try to teach you everything you'll need to pretend. Test knowledge, social cues, whatever you don't know. Just fulfill Izuku's dream, please. That I'll see what I can do. 'Twas the night before the entrance exam. Preparations for UA had been relatively simple for Izuku. Untold amounts of experience examining humans to mimic them made learning things like maths and history laughably simple. That meant there was always a surplus of time after each study session that was spent in a multitude of ways. Sometimes, Izuku would practice making expressions in the mirror, mimicking expressions of joy, sadness, anger, discomfort, and more, filing them all away for future use in fitting in. A more notable activity was the act of doodling. Concepts floated around in Izuku's mind, comrades from a sea of concepts, manifested in the form of logic-defying monsters, drawn onto paper. Some were simple, tame, like a frog that sat and cried, waiting for someone to share its sorrow with. Some were appreciable as fiction, like the marksman who received a gun from the devil capable of hitting any target they wished. And some were utterly brutal, spawned from only the minds of the most twisted writers, like the mass of barbed wire from the fourth front of a war, slithering like a serpent as the countless corpses trapped within writhed, squeezed together into a single mass. Each sketch was drawn like they were real, and in a way they were just not here. Ouch! Izuku said monotonously as he cut his finger on the paper. Annoying. Any harm to the shell would not be taken well by Inko, speaking from experience. Thankfully, nothing there had some knowledge of how to repair the shell by using the required nutrients, learned from previous shells. In order to maintain the facade of Izuku Midoriya, it had to consume food on a regular basis, lest the shell start to decompose and decay. Thankfully, with the simplicity of acquiring sustenance, this was a negligible issue. Seeing that it was getting late, Izuku closed the notebook and got into bed. He didn't need to sleep, but it was best to develop the mimicry in case someone ever shared a bedroom with him in future. Tomorrow was the day that Izuku Midoriya had looked forward to his entire life. Now, it was up to Izuku to see it through. Standing outside the massive school that was UA, Izuku couldn't help but imagine this was what the old facility he resided in was like on the outside, but a giant L instead of an H. All things considered, he couldn't wait to ditch the school bag. It felt somewhat constricting on his back. But look who's showing his face here. Izuku turned around to see a rather angry-looking blonde coming his way. Out of my way, Deku. He tilted his head in contemplation. Why was this random person speaking to him? The blonde glared into Izuku's eyes, teeth gritted as he tried to find something. Izuku didn't know what he was looking for. What, did you get a fever and fry your brain, nerd? Do I know you? Wah dash, that actually seemed to take him off guard a bit. What do you mean, oh? I get it. You're just trying to look down on me. The boy attempted to push Izuku aside, but only ended up causing his hand to sting as he pulled it back with a hiss. Don't stand in front of me. I'll kill you. With that, he was off, walking into the halls of the school. From surrounding discussions, it seemed like his name was Bakugo. Interesting. Perhaps he had some previous connection to Izuku Midoriya, something worth looking into. For now, Izuku simply walked in. He had a test to take today, after all. Meanwhile, as Bakugo walked in, there was only one thought on his mind aside from the desire to be first place. That's not Deku. Everybody say, hey. Present Mike had hoped for an energetic response. Present Mike was all right with silence. Present Mike nearly fell flat on his but when someone yelled a hey, back in his exact tone of voice and volume. Sounds like someone's a really big fan of mine. The hero took a moment to clear his throat. Moving on, the rundown of the practical exam. Izuku didn't know why everyone seemed to be acting odd, whispering amongst themselves to find whoever made the response. He had asked for it, so why did no one follow suit? Anyways, the robots were interesting. They reminded him of the green ordeals, as the employees had called them, but seemed less lethal than the rustic war machines. If all it took to pass was to scrap them, that would be easy. All he had to do was avoid damage to his shell. Plus Ultra. He heard the hero, present Mike he believed, given the discs that Izuku had of him, yell. Not bad, but he liked, face the fear, build the future, more, even if the latter was lengthier. The crowd of eager participants was a gold mine for Izuku to burn time in. So many varied reactions and behaviors to examine. He wove between the crowds, picking a few that seemed particularly interesting, only to be stopped when a firm hand gripped onto his shoulder. You. The figure appeared to be the uptight, rule-following type, judging just from his appearance and tone. Izuku pointed to himself. Me? Yes, of course. Don't you know that your odd behavior is interfering with the other students' abilities to focus and prepare? Izuku looked around at the forming crowd of viewers. I think you're disturbing them more. The boy spluttered when he realized that, indeed, he had drawn far more attention than Izuku had, immediately snapping into a 90-degree bow. I sincerely apologize to all of you. Okay, start. Present Mick's voice boomed from above, and the doors to the combat area opened. Izuku took off in an instant, leaving cracks in the concrete where he had just been standing from the force at which he launched himself, leaving the rest of the participants in the dust, literally. Immediately, he locked onto a one-wheeled robot that seemed to be the equivalent of the Green Dawn's spike arm droids, though arguably less threatening given their abundance of blunted sides. Target acquired. It droned. I'll kill Dash. Izuku proceeded to bury his fist into its chassis, snapping the clanker apart at the waist in a single blow before continuing his rampage. All over the Mach City, the robot forces were subject to the same reign of terror that a facility of at most level 4 employees had to suffer through when the dog-like thing exited its cocoon and stood up on 2 legs. Sitting before a row of screens, Nizu had been watching a number of promising candidates, but by Toshinori Yagi's own recommendation born from a sense of concern, he spared occasional glances at one in particular. My, he may be the most destructive combatant out of the entire pool of candidates. The mouse bear principal chimera thing chuckled as he watched the abnormality carve through entire legions of robots without skipping a beat. Even including your successor. That's what concerns me. Yagi muttered. Unless my judgment of him was completely wrong, or what I saw that day was a masterful facade, I cannot believe that this boy is the same as the one I saw that day. His mother was quite odd when I met her as well, and I can't help but think something's wrong with Midoriya Izuku. Quirks don't form out of nowhere, and certainly cannot be used in the way he currently is with mere months of training. To accentuate his point, Yagi pulled up Izuku's file. Mimicry, a quirk that allows for the manipulation of physical biology, most notably to mimic voices, bundled up with a boost to physical strength. That makes sense at the very least. But from what I can see, Izuku aimed his palm at an entire column of robots. The tip of a jagged bone spike poked out from his palm as he gathered gas behind it like a biological cannon. Hello. The cameras shook as the entire column was demolished in an instant, and the building on the opposite end of the street began to collapse from the force of the invisible projectile. That does not seem like simple mimicry to me. Yagi finished. Yes, it certainly doesn't. Nizu chirped, but he wasn't taking it as seriously as Yagi hoped he would, more focused on pressing the big red button. Now then, it's time to see how this year's batch does against the surprise. Izuku was briefly snapped out of his rampage as a massive robot rose over the buildings. The zero-pointer, as Present Mike had explained, an enemy that had no value in being defeated, which meant that it could be ignored. In fact, the screams of fleeing participants made Izuku almost feel at home in the corporation again. The zero-pointer should have been ignorable, if it weren't for the boy who was currently rocketing up towards it, punching it in the face with considerable force. This shut the thing down, but that also meant the bulk of it was falling down. Towards him. Izuku watched as the mass of metal blocked out the sky, and decided that it was an eyesore that had to go, morphing his right hand into a fleshy mace. Goodbye. He swung the mace, and the entire bulk of the robot went flying in that direction, leveling a few buildings as it did. With the eyesore gone, he was going to return to butchering robots, but the buzzer signaling the end of the exam froze him in place. What a shame, it had been such fun to let loose. 1 week after the entrance exam, a letter clunked into the Midoriya household's mailbox. "Mom, the letter from you is here," Izuku reported, bringing it over to the dinner table. He heard Inko stumble, likely knocking over a few things, followed by the clattering of a broom as she made a beeline straight to the living room. Sharpening the tip of his finger into a blade, Izuku sliced the envelope open, and a small metal disc clattered out, projecting a blue light upwards. "I am here as a projection." Inko clutched onto the table to stop herself from falling over in surprise from the projection of All Might suddenly yelling in her face. Meanwhile, Izuku watched with rapt attention. The man was going to be affiliated with UA this year, providing many more valuable opportunities to observe him. Perhaps Izuku would finally get the chance to peel away that grinning facade and peer into what hid beneath. "Now, regarding your performance on the tests, young Midoriya, I am proud to announce that you did outstandingly well in both the written and physical portions of the exams." The hero laughed, though years of observation allowed Izuku to take note of an undercurrent of uneasiness. "Even I couldn't defeat that many villains when I took the exam." The scoreboard flashed on screen to reveal Izuku's scores, sporting a monstrous 120 villain points, dominating the first place. A few videos played beside the scoreboard, showing Izuku in different places of the battlefield tearing robots apart, with one in particular having caught him slapping the remains of the zero-pointer to the side. "One thing that I must say is that the staff of UA recommend that you take extra care to avoid property damage. You have great power, but you must be careful in how you use it." But with all that out of the way, All Might extended a welcoming hand forwards, and Inko bit into a tissue to stop herself from releasing a river of tears. It was a far cry from how she wished to see it, but Izuku's dream had come to fruition. "I welcome you to UA, your hero academia. Don't put your feet on the desk." "Huh." Izuku stood in the doorway blankly as he watched two of his to-be classmates arguing on the first day. He decided to attempt quietly scooting past them, and preferably to a desk at the back of the classroom so he could observe the class in the not academically approved way, only to be caught by both of them anyways. The blonde one, Bakugo, turned away from him with a huff, while the one with glasses and pipes in his calves from the gate of the exam walked over. "Good morning. I am from Somei Private Academy. My name is Tenya Ida." Izuku gave a wave back, plastering a smile onto his face. "I'm Midoriya Izuku. Nice to meet you, Tenya." In the next moment, Ida had snapped into a bow. "I must apologize for looking down on you during the exam, Midoriya. Despite the odd disposition that day, your scores show that you were just as intent on becoming a hero as everyone else." Ida straightened up again, extending a hand. "I look forward to being your classmate in these coming years. Let us become great heroes together." Izuku took the hand and shook it firmly. "Likewise." As Ida speed-walked towards the next person entering the classroom, a brunette girl that had been present in the combat zone, and Izuku went to sit down, he noticed Bakugo glaring at him from the corner of his eye, attempting to do so inconspicuously. The blonde turned away again the second he was noticed, and Izuku filed the information away with the other things he had observed about Katsuki Bakugo. He would have started observing the other students more closely, but the looks of brain-melting confusion on Ida's face over by the door drew his attention to the caterpillar on the ground, with a face that looked a bit like a hobo. In all honesty, he would probably look better with a hookah. "I'm your homeroom teacher, Shudo Aizawa. Nice to meet you." The man droned as he exited his sleeping bag, rummaging through it in search of something. "It's kind of sudden, but put this on and go out onto the field." The knowledge that they were skipping orientation to do a sudden quirk assessment test almost elicited a sigh from Izuku, if it weren't for the fact he hadn't gotten that mimicry down convincingly enough yet. A grand opportunity to scout out interesting individuals wasted. If you're going to become a hero, you don't have time for such leisurely events. Aizawa shrugged in response to the questioning of the students, before going on some rant about how the Ministry of Education was procrastinating on physical tests. Izuku would like to object to that first claim. Even in Lobotomy Corporation, the death trap that it was, there was no shortage of people who liked to spend their time between work orders doing every leisurely thing they could, as it helped relieve stress and keep morale up. "Bakugo, You finished second in the practical exam, right? In junior high, what was your best result for the softball throw? At that mention, Izuku felt a burning glare from the blonde, even as he answered the teacher. 67 meters. Aizawa jerked a thumb at the circle behind him. Then, try doing it with your quirk. You can do whatever you want as long as you stay in the circle. Izuku watched as Bakugo walked over to the circle, did a few stretches, and proceeded to hurl the ball away in a burst of flame. Die. Another thing to note about the blonde, he seemed to really like telling people to die. Or maybe he just liked the word. If it was the latter, he understood very well. The second someone said the words, "It looks fun," though, Aizawa's expression seemed to darken. Some kind of intimidation tactic, for whatever reason he would need it for. "It looks fun, huh?" The teacher repeated, a rather sinister smile coming onto his face, which didn't really suit him. "All right then. Whoever comes last after the next 8 tests will be judged to have no potential and punished with expulsion." Huh. Izuku heard his classmates gasp as he simply continued to stare at the teacher. Aizawa was most likely lying, based on a few unconscious tells that Izuku had found strangely consistent among humans with standard biology and the rather hammed-up announcement. But hey, if it got the others to push themselves further, he wouldn't complain. Aizawa locked eyes with the student that had been designated as problem child number 1, top scorer Midoriya Izuku, and started to understand why All Might of all people seemed on edge when it came to him. Those eyes, though bright and innocent on the surface, were analytical in a way that spoke of years of experience, the type that could pick apart someone to the bone with a simple glance. Years of working with Nizu let him know that whatever information Izuku was getting from analyzing him, the boy was rapidly processing it for some use in the future, probably mimicry given the information about his quirk. A teenager shouldn't have that kind of skill. A teenager shouldn't have a need for that kind of skill. Perhaps it was an instinct that came with his quirk, but official records stated he was a late bloomer, so it should have been greatly underdeveloped in that case. Whatever it was, Izuku broke off from their staring competition to follow his classmates, and Aizawa allowed himself a light sigh. This one would be troublesome. "Okay, I'll tell you the results," Aizawa said as he clicked a button on his phone to display the scores, and a certain name had gone far beyond what his classmates had achieved combined, save for Ochako's infinite height ball toss. The 50-meter run, absolutely decimated in half a second. The grip test, pieces of the machine found themselves a few meters away from the place he was standing, and what data got through was an integer overflow to the poor testing equipment. Standing long jump, completely cleared the sand pit and vanished into the horizon, and returned before anyone noticed. Repeated side steps, sizable dust clouds formed on either side as the sand beneath his feet was displaced, slowly digging into the ground. The ball throw, somehow matching Bakugo's cry of "die," with an ominously monotonous "goodbye." The ball hurtled into the horizon and burst on contact with the wall on the opposite end of the testing area. Sit-ups, seated toe touch, the long-distance run, Izuku dominated in every single category. Aizawa frowned, given that part of the boy's quirk involved enhanced physicality, and the ability to manipulate it as he needed was incredibly versatile. He was expected to do well, but this was simply absurd. Such scores easily blew proper pros out of the water, and it was done by a 15-year-old. True, said 15-year-old had also demolished the most robots in UA entrance exam history, but that was him going on a rampage. What he had shown here was a capacity for precision and adaptability as needed. Odder still was that his own quirk, erasure, didn't seem to work on Izuku. Perhaps it was because his quirk was closer to a mutation type rather than an emitter, but it didn't seem to stop him from shifting his mass around. All in all, Midoriya Izuku was an anomaly of a student with impossible amounts of knowledge of using his quirk despite the short time frame he should have had it for. Behavior-wise, he resembled Endeavor's son in how impassive they were. This was not a good thing. Children their age should be expected to be expressive, whether that be through positive means like Ochako or Mina, or negative means like the brainwashing boy that went into Gen Ed. The neutrality towards everything that the two shared was closer to veteran heroes who had seen more than they wanted to, even if Izuku faced things with that award-winning smile that seemed to want to compete with All Mights. That led to the final thing. Why in the world did that boy have two expressions at maximum? He was either smiling, or his mouth was a horizontal line. There was no in between. At least Shoto could be considered consistent. Izuku felt like he was swapping between masks, with nary a single twitch visible. It seemed like All Might's concerns weren't unfounded after all. Kirishima, have the old lady fix your hand in the nurse's office, he said, handing a slip to the redhead. The rest of you, class dismissed. Tomorrow will be packed with even more rigorous tests. As he walked away, Aizawa noticed the hulking figure of the great oaf himself standing around a corner, and decided to walk over. You were right. Something about that boy doesn't line up. I feared as such. The giant sighed. What do you make of it, Aizawa? The underground hero took a glance at the departing students, the green-haired subject of discussion trailing behind the main group with that same look in his eyes. That he doesn't feel like a kid. What I look for in every class is a bud of potential, but it feels like an entire bush was brought in with the seedlings, and my concern is that it could be invasive. Suddenly, All Might's phones rang. Excuse me for a second, it's Nizu. Hello. All Might, could you and Aizawa come to my office? The mouse chirped. From the other end. I found something incredibly interesting about this year's star student. The two teachers found Nizu in front of a sea of screens, seemingly greatly amused. Gentlemen, have a look at these recordings, would you? The screens displayed Izuku walking down a hallway. His pace was steady, nothing as interesting as Nizu seemed to think. I don't see anything of note. All Might exclaimed in his usual boisterous tone, receiving a chuckle from Nizu. That's because there shouldn't be. Everything here is normal. There was a glint in the mouse's eyes as he said that last word. Too normal, in fact. He zoomed in closer to Izuku, a bar appearing on the screen that showed a certain height. With each step, Izuku would bob a bit above and below the bar, before going right back onto it. There's no variance. Every movement is exact, constant. Another bar measured the distance between each step, finding them equal down to millimeters. Even the length of every inhale and exhale was the same. Humans can't perform the same action exactly even if they make a conscious effort, and yet here Izuku is, doing it while walking. The mouse cackled. I've never seen anything like it. What do we do with him, then? Aizawa spoke up. He's performed extraordinarily well in every regard, and we can't do anything drastic without evidence suggesting him to be something more than a teenage student, no matter how eccentric he acts. What to do indeed? Nizu leaned back in his little mouse chair with a smile. We'll continue to observe him for now. He hasn't caused any trouble yet, so let's do our best to make sure he stays that way. Aizawa nodded, while All Might seemed somewhat conflicted, before giving in to Nizu's logic. Let's hope nothing goes wrong then. Izuku had not performed to the standards he usually held himself to. Perhaps it had been the lack of material. The only things that he had been able to go off of to mimic Midoriya Izuku was his dying moments and old recordings of him in his youth, leaving a vast amount of empty space to fill. He had felt the gazes of his teachers and the faint whirring of cameras in the halls. They were observing him. They had seen through a layer of his shell. This could not be allowed to continue. Further efforts would be needed to create a passable mimicry. He had to be less rigid, less consistent, more unpredictable in every movement, no matter how minuscule. He had to perfect his expressions and adapt a use of body language. He could substitute most of those with things he had learned from previous shells, those that you did not know Midoriya Izuku and therefore would perceive the current him as the genuine article. They could be deceived. Katsuki Bakugo, on the other hand, was a problem. He would have to be dealt with in future. Izuku knocked on the door of his home and decided to greet Inko with a proper smile. I'm home. The woman, upon opening the door, shrieked and fell backwards. Noticing a slit on the side of his mouth when he probed it with his tongue, it appeared that he had pushed the expression too far. Just something else to perfect. Izuku started his morning by doing stretches in the mirror, which according to the internet was a healthy morning exercise. He didn't need exercise, of course, but it was good practice to lessen the rigidity and consistency in his movements. As he did so, He also made sure to practice some extra facial expressions for later interactions with his classmates and teachers, which should help him become more approachable. It was unfortunate that he couldn't just make masks like that shy one did, because that would inflict substantial white damage on anyone he met, so learning new expressions would have to do. He slipped into his uniform and begrudgingly strapped on his school bag before heading to the door. As he put on his shoes, Izuku took a glance at Inko, who was eating her breakfast. "See you later, Mom," he said with a smile. The genuine smile she gave in return meant that it was passable. English class was incredibly simple, as Izuku had seen and mimicked the occasional English speakers back in Lobotomy Corporation. Korean was still his strong suit, though. Also, Present Mike was quickly becoming his favorite teacher in the school. Loud, expressive, and passionate, he gave a lot of material to mimic. Plus, he didn't seem to be hiding nearly as much as All Might, which made Izuku give him a few more points over that musclehead. Lunch Rush, on the other hand, was one of the few people that Izuku would say he couldn't mimic well, due to his duty-restricting interactions with students and a lack of unique features or behaviors displayed in the cafeteria. At least the food he made was good, much better than Lobotomy Corp's cafeteria. Then, there was Hero Basic Training. I am coming through the door like a normal person. All Might was probably a major contributor to the skewed social norms of this society, allowing Izuku to get away with half the things he did with only a raised brow in response. Far from as interested as his peers, Izuku half-heartedly doodled in his notebook as he watched the hero walk to the teacher's podium, taking note of the stares he was receiving from both All Might and Bakugo. What we'll do today is, the giant whipped a card out of his pocket, displaying an immensely boldened word that was a tiny bit unnecessary for a one-time use card. Combat training. That aroused a bit of discussion among the class, which only grew more excited as All Might swung towards a wall that was revealing shelves of numbered boxes. And to go with that are these: costumes made based on your quirk registrations and requests you sent in before school started. Izuku felt the corner of his mouth point upwards in what was probably excitement as his classmates surged forth to grab their costumes. It had been too long since he had fought a human. Izuku tugged on the sleeves of his coat as he made sure everything was in place, before following his rather colorful entourage of classmates into ground beta. His costume was simple, given that nothing a support company could provide would have been better than his bare skin. The first layer was a simple black suit and red tie, the same that he saw rookie agents wearing whenever a new one joined the company, and worn over it was a grayish leather long coat, a homage to one of the more impressive humans he had met. Given what he'd seen of her, that woman would probably do well in this world. The result was that it stood out in its own way. Among the others, due to being far more practical in appearance, especially compared to something like the diaper bowl beside him. As All Might and the class conversed, he continued to fill out his mental observation diary of his classmates, taking note of how they acted in their costumes. A few seemed dissatisfied with the current designs, so this was a valuable opportunity to observe their behaviors in states of minor discomfort. Most of the time, fighting villains takes place outside, but if you look at the total numbers, atrocious villains appear indoors at a much higher rate. Truly intelligent villains hide in the shadows. Personally, Izuku thought that the most intelligent villain would be the one capable of hiding right in front of you without you noticing, but the shadows were definitely another good option. For this class, you'll be split into villains and heroes, and fight 2-on-2 indoor battles. This will be a real battle for you to understand the basics of combat. As a flood of questions forced All Might to pull out a comically small script, Izuku noticed Bakugo staring very intently at him, the blonde's hands twitching as if in anticipation. He just gave a friendly smile back, and he instantly turned away, focusing his glare on All Might. Anyways, the event was simple. The villains had to hide and defend a bomb, while the heroes had to capture the villains or recover the bomb without getting caught themselves. Additionally, both teams would be given communicators to stay in touch with their comrades. In the following lot drawing, Izuku found himself paired with one of the more intriguing members of the class, the bird-headed Fumikage Tokoyami. Admittedly, he had been somewhat hoping to be matched with Mizo Shoji, due to them both having similar abilities on the surface, but what could you do? Meanwhile, their enemies were Mina Ishido and Eijiro Kirishima. One could produce acid, which was rather versatile, while the other was the boy he had seen destroying the zero-pointer. Very interesting. As he and his temporary teammate entered the building to hide their bomb, Izuku noticed the bird talking to his quirk, a sentient black shadow, fittingly named Dark Shadow. Drat, that meant he was impossible to mimic. So, what shall we do about the heroes coming to capture us, my partner in crime? Tokoyami asked, already getting into the role of villain. Ah, and for your information, my quirk Dark Shadow Dash. That's me. Grows more powerful in darkness. Izuku nodded. You should stay here and guard the bomb. I'll intercept the heroes when they enter. Is that all? What were those sayings again? The best defense is a good offense, and no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Additionally, if I don't know what I'm doing, they don't either. Tokoyami nodded in response. I see your logic. Very well then, I won't let anyone pass through this hallway. I think you mean we. Dark Shadow piped up, causing the quirk's host to sigh. Correction, we will not allow any heroes to pass through this hallway. Best of luck. Izuku gave his partner a parting salute before running down the stairs of the building to position himself on the ground floor, finding a sort of familiarity in the enclosed environment as the countdown ticked to 0. Now, let's start the indoor person-to-person combat training with teams H and E. Mina hummed a song to herself as she slid through the halls on a trail of acid, letting out a little chuckle. Eijiro's change of image was just so cute. It was a bit like watching him puff out his chest and stand up straighter to look tougher back in middle school, and you know what? It was working pretty well. The hair dye also looked pretty good on him, so they could be horn buddies, yay. He was also a lot stronger than she remembered, but that would probably help deal with his self-confidence issues from back then. Anyways, back to the present. She was on a scouting mission in search of the bomb, currently on the 3rd floor, while Eijiro had volunteered to find and fight Izuku head-on, given the boy's utterly monstrous physical capabilities, saying that it was only right for them to go against each other, man to man, in his own words. It came out corny as hell, but that's something else she liked about him. Now, let's see, where did you hide that bomb dash? The sharp pinging sound of a speaker crackling to life played throughout the building, followed by a computerized voice. Warning, O06-20 has breached containment. Huh. Firm, heavy footsteps began to approach her, loud enough that she couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from. Were they ahead of her or behind her? If it has been confirmed that it has escaped and stood on 2 feet, there is only one thing you can do. Straighten up your posture, gather your hands neatly, and pray to whatever you believe in and observe the situation as it unfolds. A hand came around the corner, gripping onto the concrete hard enough to shatter it, and Izuku's head followed, glaring at her with those blank, soulless eyes. Hello, he said in a flat, monotone voice, pulling himself around the corner and walking towards her like a robot, slowly and intimidatingly. Mina shrieked and instantly fired a stream of acid in Izuku's direction, barely managing to keep her balance as she turned tail and fled. The hell was that? Did Izuku quote a horror story to make himself more intimidating? Because it was definitely working. She decided to take a look back and immediately regretted it when everything in her field of vision was Izuku's face, just a second before she felt something wrap around her leg and pull her off balance, sending her down onto the acid-covered floor. The girl attempted to activate her communicator to warn her teammate about Izuku's location, but he bent down and plucked the device from her hands like taking candy from a child before she could even bring it halfway to her mouth. Guess it's game over. Izuku shrugged, pulling out the teacher-given roll of capture tape in preparation to wrap Mina up. The pink girl grinned in response, flinging her hand out and coating the entire roll with acid. The simple tape sizzled and melted away almost instantly in Izuku's hands, and he looked down in what seemed to count as surprise on his completely emotionless face. I'd say a cool one-liner if my heart wasn't beating faster than Tenya can run. She proceeded to try to sweep Izuku's legs, only to let out a yelp of pain as her leg bounced off the boy like he was a brick wall. Izuku loomed over her and she resisted the urge to hurl as she watched his hand deform into a fleshy mass, the other reaching out to grab her. Not bad, but try again next time. All Might and most of Class 1A shuddered as they watched Izuku bind Mina's hands and legs with some sort of rubbery tendon before dragging the girl into an empty room. In particular, Momo, Siro, and Shoji were greatly thankful that their quirks were far more publicly presentable in appearance. According to the clock, their fight had lasted a mere 2 minutes, even with Mina's respectable efforts to struggle. But really, in a head-on fight, it was perfectly expected for her to lose against an overwhelmingly physically powerful opponent, so her loss was through no fault of her own. She had simply gotten unlucky. But All Might heard a certain blonde whisper uncharacteristically beside him. The hero looked down at Bakugo, who seemed to be keeping his voice down from the others. What is it, young Katsuki? You think the nerd's weird, don't you? It was stated as a matter of fact, and that certainly wasn't wrong, though All Might still spluttered, and tried his best to pass it off as a cough. He is certainly odd, but I'm simply keeping my eyes on a promising yet volatile dash. That's not Deck Midoriya. What? The boy had been staring at Izuku's screen intently for the whole battle, some sort of burning desire in his eyes. I don't know what happened to him, or if anything happened at all, but I'm sure that that's not him. I would know, we grew up together. All Might and Bakugo stood there in front of the screen in silence, the former pondering over the ominous implications of this newfound evidence. Please meet up with Principal Nizu after school, young Bakugo. Your assistance will be invaluable. On a different floor of the building, Eijiro brought his arms up to block a massive shadowy hand, being forced back by Tokoyami's quirk. The windows had been blocked off by whatever the bird could find in preparation for the fight, allowing Dark Shadow to reach a higher level of power than normal. Give up, hero, Tokoyami announced, looking rather villainous thanks to the combination of his costume, the dim lighting, and the menacing beast that was an enlarged Dark Shadow. I will not allow you to pass. Yeah, you shall not pass. Dark Shadow cackled as they threw out another massive swipe, once again forcing Eijiro on the defensive. Feeling Dark Shadow's claws impact his guarding stance, Eijiro couldn't help but grin, seeing that his classmates were powerful in their own right. They'd have a great time together in the coming years. You know, I can't help but notice you covered up all the windows in order to use a shadow quirk. Allergic to sunlight? Tokoyami huffed. What can you do with that knowledge? Attempting to expose us to sunlight will take time you do not have. Maybe if I just open the windows. Tokoyami's eyes widened as he watched glowing red lines snake up Eijiro's arm. But I think it's time you left your room. Dark Shadow retray dash. In a single swing, Eijiro punched the roof of the building clean off. Dark Shadow shrieked and instantly wilted like a sun-dried cucumber, and Tokoyami stepped back warily as Eijiro walked towards him and the room containing the bomb right behind him, the redhead massaging his arm. That still stings, he hissed, before pasting on his grin again as he looked at Tokoyami victoriously. Looks like the heroes win again. If you strike me down, I will become more powerful than you can ever imagine. Great reference, but it won't work on me dash. The hero's communicator crackled to life. Eijiro! Eijiro paused as Mina's shrill voice pierced into his ears. The bomb's on the 3rd floor. Izuku's guarding it. What? I need help. He's too dash. The connection cut off, and Eijiro immediately punched through the floor, dropping down through the hole. Tokoyami simply watched in confusion. The bomb was right behind him, so how did Mina see one on the 3rd floor? The bird let out a chuckle as he remembered what Izuku's quirk was named. Wonderfully done, my partner in crime. 1 minute remains. All Might announced through the speakers, and Eijiro pushed himself to run as fast as possible throughout the 3rd floor in search of his teammate and the bomb. Not that room, not that one, not that one. Izuku stood in a doorway just in front of him, and behind him was Mina, her arms and legs wrapped up in fleshy tendons instead of the capture tape, and she seemed oddly okay with that. Might be because she was used to touching squishy, slimy substances due to her quirk. Eijiro froze when he saw that there was no bomb in the room. What Ash? Got you. That was not said in Izuku's voice, even though it came from his mouth. It was Mina's voice, and Izuku rolled her communicator around in his hand. By my estimations, you should still have just enough time to run back upstairs to where Tokoyami is and grab the bomb. Izuku said nonchalantly, eyes locked solely on Eijiro. Do you think you can make it? Eijiro knew a challenge when he saw one, and he channeled one for all into his legs, ready to smash right through the ceiling. I think I do. Plus Ultra Dash. Izuku pointed his palm at the ground beneath Eijiro, and something shot out of it, slamming into the concrete and shattering the entire floor. Before he could move, Eijiro found himself falling alongside the rubble. AAA? Ayaha. Goodbye, hero. Izuku said as the clock ticked down to 0. The villains win. The 4 of the students met up with their peers, one of them still trying to shake concrete dust off his uniform. That was an eventful display. All of you did as well as you could. All Might yelled, before gesturing a massive palm at the other students. Now, tell me, who do you think performed the best out of the 4? A petite hand went up. I believe it was Kirishima. Momo answered. He proved himself to be capable in many ways. He and Mina made plans beforehand that took their abilities into account, and was quick to rush to his partner's aid, a respectable quality in a hero. Additionally, his ability to determine the weakness of Fumicage's quirk and take the relevant countermeasures showed good environmental awareness and adaptability. While he was completely fooled and defeated by Izuku, I believe that his performance greatly outweighs that unpredictable event. Momo turned her gaze to the other participants. That is not to say that others performed poorly in the slightest. Fumicage made thorough preparations before the battle began to maximize the potential of his quirk, and was only defeated by a factor beyond his control. Ashido showed determination and perseverance even when in a greatly disadvantageous position by dissolving Midoriya's capture tape, though her performance was certainly the weakest of the 4 due to a poor matchup. And though I personally would have argued against Midoriya for his lack of proper planning, his reasoning was acceptable, and his combat versatility more than made up for the lack of cohesion between him and his teammate. His act of deceiving Kirishima by mimicking Ashido's voice and luring him into a trap was a great application of his quirk that brought the villain team to victory. Well said, young Yarozu. That was a lot more than All Might had expected from the girl. No wonder why she was a recommended student. As the other teams went against each other, Eijiro kept massaging his arm and brushed off any of Mina's concerns with a smile, saying that his arm was just sore. In truth, it was a lot more than sore. It wasn't broken, but did it hurt. I think you overexerted yourself. Izuku suddenly said beside him in a whisper, causing Eijiro and his heart to jump in one go. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm fine. He put on a grin and gave the arm a flex, only to immediately relax it with a hiss of pain. Izuku just shook his head at the display. You should let Recovery Girl take a look at that. It'll save you a lot of trouble, given that you've gone to her every other time you've used your quirk. Alright, fine. I'll ask All Might for a slip to see her later. Eijiro grumbled, giving into Izuku's advice. The 2 stood there and continued to watch their classmates for a while. You don't seem to be very good at using your quirk, Izuku observed, causing Eijiro to turn his head 90 degrees in an instant, and All Might to hide another choked cough. I've never seen a strengthening quirk harm its user before. In fact, it seems to be an additional ability, given that you always use your hardening beforehand. Did it develop recently? Yeah. Eijiro did his best to try and not panic at the fact that their conversation was about 2 steps away from revealing All Might's secret. I just got it during the entrance exam. Pulls on some sort of internal energy reserve to make me stronger or something. I don't get how it works fully. That explains the lines. You're one to talk about developing a quirk recently, anyways. Eijiro decided to go on the offense this time, giving Izuku a light jab with his elbow. All Might said you were going to get your quirk registered that time we met at the beach. True. Izuku admitted. I guess mine's just less volatile, which is great because Mom would not be happy if my left arm suddenly mutated into a bunch of tentacles. Just as he said that, Izuku unraveled his arm into a bundle of wriggling tendrils, and changed them back in a second so that no one else saw. This also meant that whoever looked back would be confused by Eijiro's look of, that's cool but also disgusting. Before the redhead started laughing. Izuku watched Ijiro recompose himself with a smile. No hard feelings about me dropping you through 3 floors, I suppose? None at all. Ijiro grinned, holding his fist out for a fist bump. Izuku seemed a little lost, taking a few glances between his hand and Ijiro's, and then practicing clenching his hand a few times, before finally going through with a nice, firm bump. The inheritor of One for All, and the hijacker of Midoriya Izuku's identity. The quirk inherited from All Might to pass on his legacy, and the body of a dead boy worn like a suit to fulfill his dream. It was certainly quite ironic that neither one was aware of the other's secret. Izuku had seen many things, and learned just as many skills to deal with them. He had learned languages and voices to communicate and confuse. He had learned strategies and how to dismantle them with brute force. He had learned the ins and outs of human biology, and knew how to identify someone's weak spot before even they knew about it. But he had never learned how to deal with relentless waves of paparazzi. In any other situation, the abnormality would have loved an opportunity to observe so many people, but this was just annoying. So many facades of friendly public reporters who in truth only cared for their next paycheck, and they talked over each other, too. If one more microphone was jabbed in his face, he might very well just decide to kill everyone here. Hey you! Another opportunistic member of the crowd yelled. How are All Might's class? Thankfully, it seemed that the paparazzi were still human, despite multiple factors suggesting otherwise, and were averse to the completely emotionless stare that Izuku could default to. As he entered the school, he took one glance at the crowd outside, and noticed a rather odd figure standing in the background, spindly and dressed in a rather bare-bones outfit. He also didn't have any equipment, so that meant he wasn't a reporter. Unfortunately, Izuku had lessons to get to, so as much as he would have liked to ask that person some questions, he headed in to meet his classmates. And just when he thought he had escaped the hordes of rambling maniacs, Izuku felt his face slam into the table after Aizawa announced that they would be choosing a class representative, causing almost everyone in Class 1A to start self-promoting. On the other hand, as Ida promoted the idea of an election to the class, Aizawa frowned from what he had seen from Izuku today. Nizu had pointed out multiple behavioral oddities the boy had displayed on the first day, but none of those were noticeable here, nor in the recording from yesterday. Had he been going by only his own judgment, he would have waved everything off as Izuku opening up as he became more comfortable. But with Nizu's, All Might's, and most importantly Bakugo's inputs, it felt like the boy was covering his tracks, blending in more seamlessly each time he was seen. If something's really up with that boy, he's hiding it better with each day. The class representative ended up being Momo, as she had proven herself to be well-rounded, and the vice president Ijiro, in order to balance her out. Izuku had personally predicted that Ito would get a position, as he clearly had the knowledge and personality to perform the required duties, but it seemed that human preferences outweighed logic in the end. Lunch PRD was next, and Izuku happened to be sitting next to both Ijiro and Tokoyami as he carried his incredibly varied plate of food. Hi! He greeted them both as he sat down and pulled out his notebook. Ijiro looked over in surprise. Shouldn't you finish eating first? Izuku just gave him a look as his left hand morphed into a maw and started chowing down while he went back to doodling with his free hand, paying no attention at all to his food. The redhead's jaw threatened to hit the floor, while Tokoyami watched the notebooks with intrigue, currently displaying a half-finished drawing of a humanoid figure with red smoke billowing from their head, shotgun in hand. Such a detailed drawing. The bird murmured, fascinated by the clearly occult design. What is their name? Izuku, noticing his interest, finished the sketch with haste, and gave the notebook to Tokoyami. The image now depicted the shooter in the middle of a war zone, surrounded by towering buildings and bodies with punctured heads. Der Flutschutz. They were offered a deal by the devil. A shotgun that could blow up anyone like it hit them point blank, no matter where it was fired, but the last shell would hit the head of their beloved. Unfortunately, they don't remember the person they joined the war for, but as a result, they can fire as many shells as they wish. Tokoyami continued to flip through the notebook, growing more engrossed with every drawing. Fascinating. Ijiro, on the other hand, just sat there and watched. He didn't really understand the appeal, but if his friends thought it was cool, then that was enough. Suddenly, an alarm blared throughout the cafeteria, spurring the many students of UA into a panicked frenzy, all surging towards the door at once. What's happening? Ijiro attempted to rise from his seat, but had his hand grabbed by Izuku. Izuku? You'll get swept up if you head out now. The green-haired boy noted as he watched about 100 or so people attempt to squeeze their way outside in a human tidal wave that was thankfully not composed of smiling bodies. Now it made slightly more sense to why Lobotomy Corporation never assigned more than 5 agents to each department. It was so that if something like him breached, they wouldn't crush themselves to death trying to get into an elevator. Turns out it's a lot less tolerable to be a part of the panicking crowd than the cause of it. What should I do? He wondered as more and more seniors streamed past their seats. He didn't have any white damage to hit them with to cure their panicked states, and a pin dropping could rile them up in an even greater frenzy. Both Ijiro and Tokoyami were attempting to get anyone they could to calm down, but they were also seeing that it was a fruitless endeavor. They needed something big. Izuku noticed Dark Shadow under the table. Dark Shadow, how loud can you yell? Pretty loud if it's dark enough. Why? Looking up, he noticed a nice open beam on the roof, sitting far above all the chaos, that was also rather somewhat dim. That would do. He nudged Kirishima and pointed at the beam. Can you get fumigage up there? Yeah, I can. I see, so that's your plan. Tokoyami and Ijiro leapt onto the table, allowing the redhead to channel one for all and toss the bird up high, Dark Shadow latching onto the beam and pulling him onto it. Izuku took aim at the lights of the cafeteria, generating globs of viscous, thick sludge in his palms, and fired at them, covering the lights up and darkening the area even more. Finally, Dark Shadow inhaled and made an announcement. Everyone calm down. Over by the door, Izuku saw Ida posed over the escape, seemingly performing a plan of his own, and the efforts of the two together had managed to pause the horde in its tracks. As the situation was immediately defused by Ida's report that the only intruders were those demed paparazzis, Izuku couldn't but feel a bit of sympathy for the manager of L Corp. If this was the type of chaos they had to deal with on the daily, no wonder they kept getting replaced. Next up on the schedule was rescue training, with Aizawa, All Might, and a third unnamed teacher. Unlike most of the recent events, this would be Izuku's first time experiencing the class content, as it focused on things that could only be experienced outside of Lobotomy Corporation. The thought of being taught something completely new to him was rather exciting for the boy, and it seemed that the others were just as eager to perform the duties of a hero. On the bus, though, there was a rather interesting conversation. Kirishima, your quirk is kinda like All Might's. Ijiro, who had just taken a swig from his water bottle, almost spat it out. What are you talking about, Azui? My quirk's hardening. How is it similar to All Might's? Tsu's fine ribbit. The frog replied as she whimsically kicked her legs. I mean the part where you suddenly punch really hard. Everyone else I've seen had to prepare and stuff, meanwhile you and All Might just throw your fist forwards and everything explodes. That's just a coincidence. And Izuku throws out punches like that as well. I just make preparations beforehand. Izuku defended, and Ijiro gave him a betrayed look. We're here, stop messing around. Aizawa announced, ending the conversation there. The USJ, or Unforeseen Simulation Joint as they had been told, not Universal Studios Japan, what was Japan anyways, was certainly quite large. Also, 13 was talking about how easily quirks could kill someone. Izuku didn't need to hear all this. He was a highly experienced facility cleanser. Well, back to the main event, Izuku was looking forward to it, even though it was completely peaceful. The shark had always been mumbling about the ocean whenever it swam by his containment chamber, so he hoped the shipwreck training would be N. The lights suddenly shut off all around the USJ, and a purple portal appeared at the fountain, which began spewing out a wide variety of odd-looking individuals. Is this like the entrance exam, where the lessons already started? Ijiro asked, but judging by the grim look on Aizawa's face as he donned his goggles, that would be a no. Those are villains. Well, they didn't seem like they'd be a problem to. Two things caught Izuku's eye in particular. First, was the person who seemed to be the leader of the invasion, a blue-haired boy covered in hands. His posture and appearance were rather similar to the person Izuku saw that morning standing outside the gate. The second, the far more noticeable one of the two, was the thing standing beside him. A bipedal mutant of purple flesh, its beaked face a permanent caricature of a grin. Its right arm was a spiked mace, and its left covered in spikes. Izuku looked upon the thing and felt an indignant wave of disgust. What was the point of that thing? To create a humanoid weapon? If so, where was the passion? Where was the effort? Why could it not speak? Why did it not think? Why bother making it look human if all its creator wanted in the end was a weapon? Imitation should be the greatest form of flattery. That thing was nothing more than a poor attempt at mockery. It would not learn. It would not grow. It would remain the way it was, an uncanny, disgusting failure. He raised his hand, and Idro pulled him back to join the rest of the fleeing students, while Aizawa jumped in to combat the villains. Whatever his classmate was saying, he didn't hear it. He didn't struggle, but Izuku's eyes stayed locked on the abomination. Regardless of who did the deed, that thing would not leave this place alive. Izuku was so focused on the abomination that he didn't even seem to notice as he was swallowed up by a purple mist. Izuku found himself sinking into a lake, still hyper-focused on slaying the beast. Water was a new sensation, the closest thing in the corporation being that pink sludge that one high-level agent flung from their mug, although that stuff burned far more than Mina's acid. The occasional sound of bubbles going by his ears and the change in water currents brought part of his attention to the shark villain currently lunging at him, mouth wide open. Izuku simply grabbed him by the mouth and rotated him, rendering the villain a flailing, panicking mess as he swam up to the surface with the simple swimming lessons Inko had given him. The boy found himself in the middle of the shipwreck zone, completely alone and surrounded by about a mile of water on each side, as he clambered onto the boat meant to be used in the exercise. So, it appeared the plan was to separate, or in his case isolate, the students and take them out with the villains stationed in each area. Not the worst plan, sure, but the henchmen swimming around the ship with aquatic themes were far from a level 4 suppression team. Hell, there was no way they could do anything other than red damage, so that was an entire chunk of their forces invalidated. Plus, if they dedicated an entire region to containing him specifically, that meant that the others would be distributed among the remaining regions, increasing their odds of coming out in one piece. Well then, he tested the stability of the ship, did a few preparatory squats, and took a leap. The resulting force plunged half the ship into the water, and the resulting vacuum whirlpool created havoc for every villain in the splash zone. In the collapse zone, Ijiro huffed as he knocked another villain's lights out, while explosions sounded out behind him. With the class separated, he could only hope that their more vulnerable members like Koda and Mineta ended up in the same area as Shoto or Tokoyami, because with him and Bakugo in the same region, that was most of their firepower separated. But that wasn't what he was most concerned about. Izuku was extremely weird at times, that he could admit. But the second that thing with an exposed brain stepped out of the portal, he had gone almost catatonic, and started muttering an incomprehensible chain of words that weren't in his voice. I'll hang his head over my bed. Only then can I get up in the morning without having a nightmare. Why do they commit sins knowing it's wrong? This is a forest full of hearts. No matter how many he cuts down, the forest still remains dense. Ends, begins, ends, begins, ends dash. With my infinite hatred, I give you this gift. And midway through those mutterings, he started raising his hand like every other time he had shot something. Ijiro still had no clue what the projectile was, but he was clearly ready to use it on that abomination in that dazed state. Perhaps the part that concerned him the most was that he didn't know who to fear more in that moment. Tamura Shigaraki watched in satisfaction as Eraserhead was subdued by the Nomu like a child crushing an ant, and couldn't help but find himself monologuing. Behold the anti-symbol of peace, Nomu. He cackled. The greatest berserker paladin hybrid ever created. A creature created from Sensei's nightmares, according to the man himself. Raising its right hand, one of the spikes protruded outwards, and shot into Eraserhead's arm, snapping it in two and causing the man to cry out in pain. Shigaraki laughed. And something slammed into the ground behind him. Hmm. The villain scratched his neck as he turned to see a certain mop of green hair. Ah, the elite enemy. Kurogyri said to be wary of you, given your performance in the records, Nomu. The Nomu stepped off of Eraserhead and trudged towards the dust cloud. Izuku stood up slightly slumped forwards, both eyes still locked on the approaching Nomu. The abomination snarled and lunged forwards with its mace hand. And Izuku caught it in his own, as the beast pushed its weight down onto the boy. Oh, he's more tanky than he looks, Tamura noted, and decided to have some fun, dashing in to attack. Izuku wasn't impressed, honestly. The thing wasn't that strong. Pathetic. All he had to do was... Blood started to burst from his arm, and his eyes widened. That wasn't him bleeding, that was the shell. The shell was taking damage. The shell was taking damage. In the midst of it all, Shigaraki snuck his way over and latched his hand onto Izuku's, chuckling as it decayed away, revealing the muscle beneath. Izuku immediately disengaged, only for the Nomu to fire a hail of spikes at him, each one piercing into his torso and drawing more blood. He looked down in concern, anger, sorrow, hatred. Flesh burst from underneath him, the walls closing up like a reverse blooming flower, and Izuku gave one last glare at the Nomu as the meat walls sealed up. To protect a person, the shell of another is needed. But this one had a second phase. Finish him before he can do anything, Nomu. Tamura ordered, and the hulking beast stepped forth, swinging its arm at the cocoon. It slammed into the flesh, and did absolutely nothing. Grew? The Nomu warbled, and began absolutely wailing on the bulb, its efforts doing absolutely nothing. Tamura watched in growing unease as he realized whatever the kid was doing, he was managing to hold back the Nomu designed to kill All Might. And everyone knew that a cocoon was a mere stepping stone to whatever would come out. Had he mistakenly stumbled upon a secret boss? Master Tamura, Kurogyri said as he materialized next to him. One of the students escaped. Their reinforcements will be arriving soon. The smoky servant had expected Tamura to snap at him, but he just scratched his neck a bit more fervently. That's fine. Prepare a return spell. Is something wrong, Master Tamura? Kurogyri's eyes drifted onto the blinking, pulsating cocoon, each passing moment making it pulse with more force. I know a secret boss when I see one. If Nomu can't deal with him before All Might gets here, then we need a quick escape button. A dreadful snapping sound cut through the silence of Kurogyri's obedience, and the two looked over to see Nomu's neck snapped 180 degrees around. Their superweapon stumbled back as its regeneration quirk worked overdrive to keep it alive, while a flesh-covered arm tore its way out of the cocoon, followed by the rest of Izuku. There were eyes all over the suit of veiny meat he had layered over himself, each one blinking and staring in a different direction before locking onto Nomu, a manic, almost bestial look in each of them, and just like Nomu, his left hand was a mace, his complete with haphazardly protruding bones. Kill him, Tamura ordered. Kill him now. The Nomu turned its head back on the right way and shrieked, raising its palm. Hello! Izuku fired first, and the Nomu's arm was torn clean off its body. A mere half of a second later, a quarter of the USJ's roof shattered, and the resulting wind blast threatened to throw Tamura off his feet. A trail of displaced clouds could be seen if one were to look up at the sky, the hypersonic projectile having cleaved a path through them. The Nomu's severed arm slowly began to regrow, as it charged in with its other arm, attempting to smash Izuku as it had earlier. In response, Izuku's arm morphed into an utterly massive sickle, its edge gleaming as he swung it at the incoming beast. Goodbye. Tamura didn't see the scythe move, only knowing that it did. The Nomu froze, only moving forwards by its own momentum. Then, with a bloody splattering sound, it split clean down the middle and fell apart, dead in an instant. No fanfare, no grand cry of a secret move, their weapon to destroy the symbol of peace himself had been split like a watermelon. The many eyes turned their ire upon Tamura. Kurdash. Just barely in time, a portal of mist appeared in front of Tamura to shield him from another hello, and Kurogyri returned the projectile with another portal, watching it slam straight into Izuku's head. The boy wasn't even fazed as he ripped the jagged piece of bone from his face, failing to draw even a drop of blood. It was clear that they could do nothing against him. So the villains turned tail and ran, dropping through another one of Kurojire's portals the second they could without a word. Izuku stood there silently, before the flesh and mutations reseeded into his body, repairing all the wounds on the shell. Good riddance. Tamura tumbled onto the floor of the bar that was his base, and took a deep breath to relieve his suffering heart, unable to stand as his legs had turned to jelly. Milliseconds. He had been milliseconds from death, had it not been for Kurojire's foresight, unable to even finish his sentence before his enemy had fired. I take it the raid failed. A voice said over the television, and Tamura's eyes moved as much as they could to see its screen. Sensei. No matter, Tamura, we simply did not prepare well enough. Another voice could be heard from the television. Yes, we underestimated them. By the way, what happened to Nomu, my masterpiece? Dead. Kurojire reported. Bisected on the floor of the USJ. What dash? I suppose it cannot be helped. The first voice, Sensei, said, silencing his co-conspirator. We had expected it to be as powerful as All Might, but I suppose estimations are often Rho dash. It wasn't All Might. Shigaraki yelled. It was a student. The villain had started curling into a ball, scratching himself all over as if it would rid him of the memories of being torn apart by that glare. They had a secret boss among their ranks. The Nomu made him bleed at first, but then he tore it apart in seconds. He destroyed our plan alone. I regrouped with Master Tamura after the fight had begun. Kurojire reported, adding in his side of things. He had ordered the Nomu to attack a fleshy cocoon that the student had formed, and told me to prepare an escape route, claiming that he was getting a bad feeling. That turned out to be true. Had I not been warned, we may very well have died. Died? I believe that our remains would have been unrecoverable had his attack on Master Tamura succeeded. He showed no restraint. How very interesting. Can you describe this boy further? Midoriya is quirk, mimicry, capable of manipulating and mutating his flesh, but clearly to a far greater degree than previously expected. Midoriya Izuku? The second voice asked in confusion. He registered that quirk mere months ago. And years before that, I diagnosed him as quirkless myself. He greatly resembled the Nomu after mutating. Sense fell silent, sounding almost wary as he asked his next question. Did this say the words, hello, and goodbye, when attacking? Yes, he did, Master. Is this of import a dash? Midoriya Izuku is to be avoided in any and all future plans. Do you understand, Tamura? Sensei barked, the borderline panic in his order stunning both Kurojire and Tamura. Sensei? That oaf doesn't know what he's led into his school. If you plan to continue targeting UA, it is of the utmost importance that Izuku is as far away as possible. And more importantly, do not let it get its hands on you. I don't understand, Master. What is it about this boy that even you fear? That I told you that the Nomu was created in the image of a nightmare I had. That boy, or rather, the thing in his skin, is that same nightmare. Sensei answered gravely, sending a chill down Tamura's spine. If he remains in the facade of Izuku still, then you have only scratched the surface, both figuratively and literally. Do not attempt to dig any deeper. Yes, Sensei. Good. It appears that I will have to readjust numerous plans of my own. Stay well, Tamura. The villains of Japan need you to be their symbol, and if you wish to do so, it would do you well to refuse to touch Izuku with even a 29.5-foot pole. The television shut off, and Tamura was left to wonder about just what dreadful hidden event was coming UA's way. The doors of the USJ slammed open hard enough to shake the entire entryway as All Might made his debut. I am here. The first thing the hero noticed was that there was no sign of active villain activity anywhere he looked, with the exceptions of the two domed disaster zones. This was great, don't get him wrong, but surely a band of villains confident enough to attack UA wouldn't have allowed themselves to be defeated by a single class. The second thing he noticed was the incredibly mixed variety of looks on the faces of the students by the doorway. Mina, Ochako, Shoji, Sato, and Siro. All of them looked at the center of the USJ with expressions of horror, awe, and disgust, even as two of them knelt beside the half-disintegrated body of 13. Then, upon turning his gaze to the central plaza, he understood why. Two halves of something was just lying there in a growing puddle of blood, too unnatural in appearance for it to be a simple villain, and beside it, a blood-soaked Izuku was looking over Aizawa's mangled form. As suspicious as he was, Izuku had shown no desire nor reason to hurt his classmate and teachers, so the way things went was probably that the beast had nearly killed Aizawa, and was killed in turn by Izuku. That was not much more comforting, given the shattered sky dome above. Questioning later, students first. Students! He bellowed, instilling them with relief with his voice and presence alone. Gather outside the USJ, the police and heroes will be arriving shortly. Having managed to completely decimate their sector, Eijiro and Bakugo started their journey towards the central plaza. As they walked, the redhead couldn't help but take a glance at the hole in the ceiling after something incredibly powerful shot through it. By process of elimination, it was Izuku's doing, likely done in order to defeat the villain's weapon. He couldn't help but let a nervous grin on his face. He probably wouldn't be doing anything like that with One for All anytime soon. Even if he had the power to, at the cost of breaking his limbs, he lacked the precision and skill to do so. Beside him, Bakugo gave the remnants of the attack the same scrutinous glare, judging it silently. Shoto, atop the landslide area surrounded by frozen villains, had his normally impassive expression deviate just slightly as he continued to stare at the result of Izuku's attack, a projectile that cared not for what was in its path. His father would likely demand for him to be first in the upcoming sports festival, to overcome everyone else in his class by using his fire, but he wouldn't understand without having seen this. Izuku had long since proven himself to be a formidable opponent, but there was no amount of ice and fire that would be able to match that single projectile. Honestly, he'd be perfectly fine settling for second place against that freak of nature. Izuku seemed to participate to see things through rather than out of any ambition, so he was closer to an obstacle than a rival. Not trying to climb Mount Fuji would allow him to compete against the likes of Bakugo, Ida, Momo, and Eijiro. Plus, it'd tick his father off, and that was worth almost anything. Over in the mountain zone, Momo was currently struggling to carry a brain-fried Denki to the entrance, because Mineta's diminutive size was not helpful in the slightest. The only other person in the area who could have helped, Kyoka, was rather distressed after hearing something during the fight, and Momo couldn't bring herself to ask the girl for help. Goodbye. Kyoka fought back another shiver as she heard the voice replay in her head. She had heard it from across the, reverberating along the ground in a way that only she could hear with her quirk, and it terrified her. All Might's cry of, "I am here," despite how loud and brash it was, never failed to cause morale to skyrocket, a beacon in the darkest of times. That, goodbye, she heard was its antithesis, an almost inhuman utterance of a single word that chilled a person to their core. Mineta being a pervert even in these circumstances was also not helping her recover from that experience. Point 17, 18, 19, 20. Detective Tsukachi Naomasa completed his checkup on the UA students, pleased by the fact that none of them had suffered any injuries. The fact that half of them were giving the green-haired boy odd looks and a margin of space between them was a little odd, but maybe it was because he was dripping wet from head to toe. Behind him, dozens of villains that had participated in the raid were being loaded into police vans, every single one completely demoralized by the death of the supposed All Might killer, the only reason they were so confident in their chances. The Inomo, as described by the more cooperative villains hoping to knock a year off their sentence, was allegedly a bioengineered weapon created by the mastermind behind the attack, backed up by the asymmetrical biology revealed by its cross-sectioning. And for it to have what sounded like multiple quirks, could it be? He'd be seeing All Might later, anyways, no need to worry about it right now. As the students were brought back to the safety of the school in a bus, however, Tsukachi couldn't help but feel slightly worried by the hole in the USJ. It felt like All Might himself had done the damage, and very few had the power to match that. Whoever had done that was likely the one to have torn the Nomu in half, and while none of the students had said anything, it was somewhat obvious who was responsible once you knew what their quirks were. He doubted Izuku would receive any repercussions for his actions. The villains had stated that the Nomu was a weapon, not a villain, so he had simply put down someone's abominable arts and crafts project, and it was out of self-defense in a life-or-death situation against something made to kill all might of all people. Logically speaking, there was nothing to hold against him, even if legal arguments could be made. But if he was really that powerful, the detective could only hope that UA's staff knew what they were doing with that boy. Izuku watched the scenery go by as the bus drove back to, mostly satisfied. The abomination was dead, though he had hoped to get the blue-haired boy as well. Not to kill him, of course. That would both be incredibly troublesome to deal with due to the stigma against heroes killing people, and it would waste the valuable information that he likely had. All in all though, things ended up fine. At least, that should have been the case, but the amount of people currently staring at him made it seem like something else was wrong. Do I still have blood on me? Izuku asked, only drawing more stares and causing the existing ones to widen further. That's not it at all. Mina yelled. It's because of whatever the hell you did. Shiro pulled a strand of tape from his elbows and allowed Sato to chop it in half with his hand to accentuate the point. We watched that thing beat Aizawa-sensei halfway across the river Styx, then you went into an egg and hurg. Mina resisted the urge to hurl, leaning on Ochako for comfort, who gave the pink girl a few calming pats on the back. Ah. So it was about that part. What about it? The entire bus fell silent for a moment. Dude, you cut it in half and got showered in its blood. It wasn't human if you're worried about murder. Plus, it was trying to kill us. What exactly was the problem they were trying to confront? They seemed more worried than anything. Finally, Ijiro couldn't take any more. You started saying some weird stuff when you saw it, man. It was like you couldn't hear anything, and then you started raising your hand to do that palm blast thing of yours. Did he? That was something to look out for then. Was there something about that villain that disturbed you, Midoriya? Tenya asked, less in the loop due to having been away for most of the main events. If so, may I advise visiting Hound Dog Sensei sometime in the future? A hero must maintain their health in every way, both physical and mental. Izuku saw the concern of most of his classmates, most likely directed at his completely nonchalant behavior towards going face-to-face with the villain's powerhouse and killing it, and simply turned back to the window. It was disgusting. That's it. A few days later after the event, Izuku found himself waiting in a locker room in his gym uniform, waiting alongside his classmates to enter the stadium. The sports festival. Judging by the things he'd experienced so far, it seemed that he couldn't show off his abilities nearly as freely as he had up until this point. While it was true that his partial transformation was a vast exception, an incredibly circumstantial response to eradicate that disgusting thing they called a nomo, he doubted any major uses of his flesh shifting would be accepted by the masses watching, if his classmates were already barely avoiding throwing up from day one. It also sounded like the students saw this event as an incredibly important opportunity, enough for dozens of students to come to their doorstep to scout out the enemy, so it wasn't really fair if someone who really wanted a position had it taken by him, who didn't really care for rankings. On the other hand, he wasn't going to just roll over and do nothing. That would be pointless. So he had decided to challenge himself a bit. Izuku would try to score as low as he could while still qualifying. That sounded like fun. Passion. One of the few things Izuku had never been able to truly copy from his years of observing humans. Drive, he could understand. He had been endlessly pursuing his goal of mimicry after all. But to truly devote one's entire self to a single goal, to be emotionally charged by the desire to accomplish it, it was yet another reason why he had always adored humans. But right now, surrounded by so much of it, he still didn't comprehend it in the slightest, and it was a little disheartening to see all these students with their own dreams being absolutely crushed by the more capable around them. Shoto had taken the lead with his ice, and had multiple members of 1A hot on his tail, and a few from the other classes as well. Izuku stalked behind them, taking slow but steady steps to stay around the middle of the crowd that wasn't frozen still. That woman once said that it was the survivors who were strong, and not the other way around, but clearly, she would have hated this event that favored the strong. The first proper obstacle was the Robo Inferno. The small robots were completely irrelevant to him, and the zero-pointers were dealt with by the other students, so all he had to do was either run past or over them. Then, there was the fall. He just jumped from platform to platform, or off the ropes if necessary. Really, all you needed to deal with this one was the training to not fall off the ropes, Quirk Speed Med. Finally, the minefield. He just stood at the entrance until about 30 people had gotten through, and dashed across it fast enough to outpace the mines. With all the cameras focused on those in the frontmost positions, the only ones who noticed his behavior were those actively watching his performance. In the end, Izuku scored 31st place, with the first 42 passing. That meant he could have gone lower, but any more and the looks of, "What the hell are you doing?" from his classmates would probably be intense enough to bore a hole through his skull. Anyways, congratulations to Shoto for narrowly achieving first place, having had to fight tooth and nail to snatch it from Ijiro and Bakugo. Moving on, the next challenge would be the cavalry battle. A game of snatching headbands from the opponent would certainly be chaotic with all the teams running amok, and in truth, Izuku wanted to not team up with anyone from his class. For one, they'd know that he was holding back no matter what he did, and for another, he wanted to meet someone new. Which was why he was somewhat pleased to see a certain confrontational purple-haired boy walk over to him. "Hi." "Hello." The two stood there silently for a moment. "So, you're from 1A, right?" "Yep." Izuku felt a faint jab of white damage hit him, and the boy grinned, before turning to a duo of blank-stared students, consisting of Ojiro and Aoyama. "Alright, get over here." "Well, why not?" 13 million volts. Half the present teams were stunned by a combination of Kaminari's attack and Shoto's ice in an instant, leaving them wide open for Shoto's team to snatch up their headbands. With Ida providing propulsion for the roller skates created by Momo, it was clear that Shoto's team was one of the best compositions in the competition. Sure, they had the 10 million point headband, but it was still best for them to stock up on backups and solidify their position. The only thing that could stop them now was either an incredibly powerful and unexpected quirk, or Demented. Shoto couldn't help but think as. His team found themselves right in Izuku's line of sight. Glancing at their composition, Ojiro was a negligible threat given that he was countered by Kaminari, while Aoyama seemed incredibly tired from overuse of his quirk, but their rider was a complete anomaly. It looks like the top-ranked Team Todoroki is going up against some of this competition's underdogs. 3 members of Class 1A, and General Education student Hitoshi Shinso. Aizawa filled in. Since they're all familiar with one another, that means whatever tricks Shinso's got up his sleeves will decide the outcome. You hear him, folks. Let's see what the students of General Education have to offer. Aizawa elected to not mention that Izuku was massively underperforming compared to his record-breaking performances, which made his low placement in the first round incredibly odd. Given how Shoto's team was reacting, they were being incredibly wary, and for good reason. Their familiarity with one another made them the only ones present to know that fighting Izuku head-on was as effective as trying to fight Ijiro head-on, which, as several other teams were learning, was a suicide mission. "Just what is that boy doing?" Aizawa muttered to himself amidst present mixed passionate ranting. "Oi, how's the weather up there?" he said randomly. What? Is all that ice impairing your hearing?" A provocation tactic, it seemed, probably something to do with his quirk. "Ida, get us out of here." "Right. Oh come on, I'm trying to ask you a question here." "And we aren't in Ter's dash." Denki suddenly fell silent, and the boy grinned. "There we go. Drop him." Shoto suddenly fell to his left as Denki stopped supporting a third of the weight, only barely managing to stabilize himself with ice before he touched the floor. The opening was massive, however, and he felt a handful of headbands get snatched away by Izuku, who had elongated his fingers into tendrils to grab 5 of them, handing them over to the boy on top. "Darn it, didn't get the 10 million. Might be better that we didn't though," he muttered as he counted through the headbands, before looking down at Izuku. "You're a versatile one, aren't you?" "I suppose you could say that." Izuku replied, causing the purple-haired boy to jerk back in surprise and shock. You, since when? 1 minute left. Present Mike screamed from the commenter's stand. Shoto gritted his teeth as Denki snapped himself out of his hypnotized state in surprise, watching Izuku's team run off with the newly acquired headbands. Those points were effectively removed from the game, and the grim looks on his teammates' faces showed that they agreed. Thankfully, with the most valuable headband still in their possession, they just had to keep it protected to guarantee first place. Change of plans, we're going on the defensive. Izuku's team likely wouldn't be a threat in the last few minutes if they were leaving, likely because they now had a better grasp on the rider's quirk. That team from Class 1B who had shown to be rather competent didn't have a good answer to them, given that the two hadn't met the entire game, which left, speak of the devil. Ida barely pulled them out of the way of a rocketing Bakugo, who got dangerously close to snatching another one of their headbands before being pulled back by Zero. With Ijiro at the head of that team, strong enough to support their structure with one hand, they had to ensure that they stayed out of reach, a task made harder by Mina's acid and Zero's tape. Sorry about this. The redhead said with an apologetic look as tape and acid started flying, and Bakugo prepared for takeoff again, all their gazes locked on the headbands around Shoto's neck. Tee. Shoto threw up a wall of ice, but it wouldn't last long under the assault, already melting from Mina's acid. Then, mere seconds later, it fractured inwards, shattered by Ijiro as his fist flew towards Shoto, red lines already snaking up it. Instinctually, Shoto brought his arm up to block it, and paused at the sight of his flames lining his arm. In that opening, Ijiro swung his arm to the side, the resulting wind blast completely disarming Shoto, and the pyrokinetic watched as his classmate's hand reached out to grab his headband. Recipro burst. Ida's engines suddenly roared to life with blue fire, and Shoto's team had to grip onto his shirt hard as they found themselves rocketing forwards, just out of Ijiro's reach, and then out of Zero's range. Huh. Oh come on. No fair. What happened? So fast, so fast. Present Mike shrieked into his microphone at the sudden escape. Ida, if you could accelerate that fast, then show you us in the prelims. It wasn't fully enough to escape though, and as Ida's engines shut off from their overdrive mode, Bakugo was still in hot pursuit, having course-corrected mid-air, and was now lunging right for them. Momo generated as many barriers as she could, but each one was blown to bits by the barrage of explosions raining down on them. Half and half dash. Shoto braced in preparation to defend against the angry blonde. Time ease up. Bakugo was stunned for long enough to forget about propelling himself, and slammed into the floor. Demon IT. First place, Team Todoroki. Second place, Team Katsuki. Third place, Team Hitoshi. How long were you lucid for? Since the beginning. Excuse me, what the F dash, Shinso groaned, before holding out his hand incredibly reluctantly. That I guess I should thank you for playing along. Izuku shrugged as he shook the boy's hand. Hey, you did most of the work. I just grabbed stuff. You'd probably be able to beat everyone here if they weren't either antisocial or me. That's more of a compliment than anything I've gotten in the last month. I guess you Hero Corps students aren't all bad after all. Shinso gave a parting wave as he headed out to get lunch. Now then lunch. He could sit with his classmates and have a chat before the final round, but he wasn't hungry, and had a sizable stock of nutrients for emergency repairs, so he figured he'd just wander for a bit, maybe see if he could find anyone interesting to observe, like the heroes who were stationed as security. Before he could do that though, Izuku heard something that definitely drew his attention. What did you want to talk about? Yet another benefit of abnormality biology, it was quite easy for him to listen in on specific conversations, even if said conversations were being had through a metal wall. Izuku deviated from the main path, and headed towards the faculty and student entrance. That's rough. Ijiro had absolutely no idea how to respond to any of this. The fact that Shoto had picked up on his connection with All Might, and had proceeded to trauma dump about his father thinking of him only as a tool to surpass All Might. Everyone knew that Ijiro was about 75% meathead. What was he supposed to say to all that? Oh. Shoto turned with gasp to see Izuku just standing there beside the doorway. That's a lot of baggage. That I shouldn't be surprised. The boy just sighed. But since you're here, I might as well make my declaration. Midoriya Izuku. Kirishima Ijiro. You're both strong, absurdly so, and everyone in 1A knows that. But even so, I will fight for first place in this competition with only my mother's side. If you say so. Izuku just turned to leave. I'm not interested in first place, so good luck. Shoto seemed lost for a moment, a hint of anger in his voice when he spoke again. Why not? With all your power, taking first place should be simple for you, barely an inconvenience. It'd be kinda unfair to people like you, no? Izuku shrugged. Better to let someone who properly values it to have it. For a moment, Shoto seemed like he wanted to say more, but simply clenched his jaw and walked away. Ijiro continued to stand there with Izuku for a while. So, wanna get lunch together? Why not? The two decided to put Shoto's emotional baggage off to the side for now as they headed to get some takoyaki or something from the stands. What do you think the next event will be? Whatever they've got planned, I hope they'll give us a chance to show how manly we are. This was not what I meant. Ijiro gulped as he looked upon the screen. His first match was against Izuku. Izuku. Really? Sure, he was the guy who had inherited All Might's quirk, plus he had his own hardening quirk to top things off, so against literally anyone else, he wouldn't back down in a physical fight. But Izuku was the guy who had both outsmarted him in their hero training lessons, and according to his classmates, made light work of the Nomu designed to kill All Might. Even if, by his own admission, he wasn't aiming for first place, he clearly hadn't been trying to lose either. Looking over at his classmates for support, they simply gave him looks of sympathy and pity, probably thankful that the two powerhouses of their class were tied down with each other. The only one to give him a pat on the shoulder was Izuku himself. I'll see you in the ring. Good luck. Ijiro sighed, before deciding to accept his fate, turning to grin at Izuku. Time to see what should have happened during training. We've had a ton of exciting matches today, but I hear that this one's special to a certain teacher of UA. Present Mike cried, causing Eraserhead to sigh. Yes, he was actually somewhat curious about this one, but did it have to be announced? Well, at least he hadn't been name-dropped. That's why I'll let you be the announcer this time, my mummified seal host. Let's give it up for Eraserhead, everybody. Scratch that. Fine. Aizawa groaned as he leaned in towards his microphone. But only because I know you don't take no for an answer. The two members of Class 1A that would be fighting flashed onto the screen as they approached the battlefield. On the left side is Kirishima Ijiro, quirk, hardening. He's proven time and time again in my lessons to have a powerful mix of offense and defense, alongside the adaptability, perseverance and determination to back those skills up. Against almost anyone else, I'd bet on him winning because of those qualities. The crowd cheered at the sight of the competition's consistent second-placer, who flexed one of his arms in response. Unfortunately, he's up against the worst person he could fight. On the right is Midoriya Izuku, quirk, mimicry. Despite his low scores in this festival compared to his peers, some of you may have noticed that Class 1A has consistently avoided him for the entire competition, and anyone who's tried to screw with him has been unsuccessful. A few hushed murmurs spread through the crowd at that mention. At the risk of sounding biased, I believe he's barely been trying. Those of you who've been paying attention to the candidates that aren't on the podium should agree. And yes, this is a personal message from teacher to student. Midoriya, even though you've been qualifying, you should put a bit more into it for this part. Plus ultra, as the school motto goes. Alright, fine. Izuku sighed as he stepped into the ring. Meanwhile, Ijiro was screaming at Aizawa internally. Don't make him try harder, Aizawa-sensei. I've never heard you say that much about your students before. Well, that's all from good old Eraserhead for now, folks. Match, start. The instant the word, start, ended, Ijiro lunged forwards for a preemptive strike, arm already charged with one for all. Even now, Izuku had chosen to wear that impassive face, and had chosen to just stand there, menacingly. Very well then. Red smash. Izuku simply sidestepped the blow like he was watching a child run at him, as Ijiro threw his fist forwards. The supercharged punch landed on thin air, and the resulting blast of force blew off many hats and drink cups in the spectators' stand near where it landed. Most present in the stadium hadn't even seen them move. Izuku then proceeded to bury his fist into Ijiro's exposed side, knocking the hardened redhead back as he pulled on a previous mimicry, an agent who had wielded a glimmering golden gauntlet. In the literal blink of an eye, Ijiro's already on the back foot. That stings, doesn't it? Ijiro took a few breaths as he readjusted his stance. His attempt to end the fight as soon as possible with that strike had left him with a sore arm and an even more sore side. That was probably one of the worst ways it could have gone, but at least he wasn't out just yet. Any chance you'll let me knock you out and move on to the next round? Maybe if you fight well enough. Izuku responded as he attacked this time. Ijiro put up his arms to guard against the first devastating blow, and was forced to dodge backwards as Izuku's other arm aimed for an uppercut that would have disarmed and disoriented him. Just a blink later, Ijiro's heart beat 3 times faster as he saw Izuku's palm aimed at him, and threw his entire body to the side as one of those absurd bone bullets impacted the concrete like a brick of C4, absolutely decimating the arena where it landed. That Eraserhead, what have you been feeding that kid? And why was he holding back all this time? I told you, Class 1A collectively agrees that he's a monster, and it's not just because he's strong. We don't always get what he's thinking either. A little harsh, Aizawa-sensei. Izuku yelled at the commentator's booth as Ijiro leapt forth from the dust cloud of his attack. The inheritor took a more boxer-like approach, throwing out punches while staying nimble to dodge what Izuku threw his way. In response, the green-haired boy decided to toss in a few more mimicries. His fingers sharpened into a sharp hoe-like shape that he used to hook onto one of Ijiro's arms, pulling him in close and personal as the other morphed into a massive set of bird's talons, raised to slam him into the ground. Ijiro grabbed hold of Izuku's waist, and praying that the boy wasn't secretly as heavy as a sack of bricks, threw him over his shoulder, where he plunged his hand into the ground and skidded to a stop. "You've gotten a bit better, Ijiro," Izuku admitted as he reconfigured his arms again, settling for his old reliable meatball mace. "Seem to be taking less recoil damage from your quirk too. Save the flattery for after the fight," Ijiro retorted, channeling one for all throughout his body in advance. "I haven't shown you everything either." Up in the spectators' stands, Toshinori Yagi watched the fight with rapt attention. Young Kirishima was doing well, having mastered one for all to the point that he could use about 15% without self-destructing, and more if he was willing to give up a limb. His successor had trained hard to improve, and that was clear in everything he did. That had only served to prove just how absurd Izuku was in comparison though. The redhead was clearly pulling out every trick he knew one by one, and his opponent hadn't even broken a sweat. To the untrained eye, it might seem like Izuku was having difficulty defending against Ijiro's relentless onslaught of strikes, each punch strong enough to knock out the average villain on its own, but his breathing and balance had remained completely unaffected throughout the fight that his withered form's eyes could only see a part of. There must be a way to surpass him, even if only for an instant. He muttered to himself. "Find it, young Kirishima." Ijiro was getting slower, getting tired from the length of their battle. That was simply how biological life forms worked. A bit of a shame, really. Ijiro was the only one who reasonably had the skills to defeat him, so he had hoped for just a bit more. He did quite respect that one attack Ijiro had done where he sacrificed a few of his fingers to launch a blast of air, releasing the immense force of his quirk while keeping his hand mostly intact to continue defending with. It hadn't been close to enough for him to want to be knocked out by it, but it was still respectable. Had enough yet? Izuku asked his opponent, currently gasping for air in the brief moment of relief from their duel. Everything seems to suggest otherwise. Izuku slowly walked towards his opponent to end the match. "You did great though. I honestly didn't think you'd last this L-dash. H. Ijiro's head suddenly snapped up to lock eyes with Izuku, containing the burning gaze of a last-ditch effort. His arms exhausted, Ijiro used one for all in his legs instead, pivoting off one to slam the other into the approaching Izuku's waist. "Ah." Having somewhat let his guard down, Izuku found himself knocked back by the blow a bit. What was the plan with that attack? Because it was clearly a desperation attack, but Ijiro knew from the rest of their fight that he could tank at least one direct hit. So what? The ring out. On the very brink of the decimated white line, Izuku brought himself to a halt by planting his foot into the concrete. Phew, that was close. Wait, why was Ijiro still screamy? Iwa. A second blow slammed into Izuku's back, ripping him out of the concrete and over the line. Alright, he would admit, he hadn't expected that Ijiro had enough in him to pull off a two-hit combo. Congratulations to him then. As he laid there, Izuku realized that it was probably best if he pretended to be at least somewhat tired. It might give Ijiro a bit more satisfaction, and that Angel FTS knew the boy deserved it. With that completely unpredictable second wind, Ijiro moves on to the next round. A bit before his round against Ijiro, who was recovering in Recovery Girl's office after decimating his body to knock Izuku out of bounds, Shoto found himself sitting next to Izuku, who was currently doodling in his sketchbook. For someone who could have gone through the entire competition without a sweat, he was rather satisfied with his placement. Midoriya. Regarding what you said this afternoon, Shoto sighed as he looked at his left side. When you said you weren't aiming for first place, I felt anger. Anger at the fact that you were refusing to use all your strength. It felt like you were looking down on me. The others must think the same of me. Izuku hummed a tune to himself as he continued to doodle. I get if you find it a bit odd, but can I tell you a story? Why not, I suppose? Flipping through the sketchbook, Izuku stopped on a page titled, The Warm-Hearted Woodsman, the image depicting a hulking colossus of steel. The boy cleared his throat as he began to narrate. The friends were imperfect in one way or another, so they helped each other to fill what they were lacking and embarked on a journey to make their wishes come true. The Scarecrow wanted a brain, the Tin Woodsman wanted a heart, the Cowardly Lion wanted courage, and Dorothy wanted to return home. The one they thought to be the Great Wizard instead gave the Woodsman a lead heart. But you're a machine, that means you were built to serve humans. Don't you understand? Machines don't need a heart. Good job making it all the way here though, take this as compensation. Be sure to tell everyone waiting for you that your wish definitely came true. Some left with satisfaction. The friends departed and were never to be seen again. The hard, cold lead was depressing. The Tin Woodsman couldn't agree with this. In anger, he swung his axe through the wizard's heart. The warm heart was pulsing vigorously. He shoved the lead into the wizard's now empty chest. For the first time in his life, the woodsman started laughing at the sight and felt a pleasure he'd never had before. Grabbing a chunk of mushy hearts, he shoves it into his chest. There will never be enough hearts. Once a woodsman, he now fells people instead of trees. This is a forest full of hearts. No matter how many he cuts down, the forest still remains dense. A kind person would carry a warmer heart. Shoto didn't really know how to feel about somewhat relating to a murderous automaton in Izuku's daydream drawings, but he certainly did think his father was as morally bankrupt as the wizard. But is this your attempt to help? Because it's very indirect. Only if you want it to be. He shrugged as he went back to doodling. But you know you can't shiver in the cold forever. Who cares if your dad thinks your fire is his? That just means there's nothing more satisfying than giving him a middle finger of fire using it. The speakers crackled to life, calling for Shoto to prepare for his match, and so he went, feeling just a bit better from their brief and rather odd exchange. Kirishima. Shoto said just before they started beating the devil out of each other. What made you the way you are now? What do you mean by that? Ashido said something about you being different in middle school, such as having black hair. I'm simply curious as to what made you the way you are now. Of course she let that slip, the minute Mina. Ijiro groaned. Well, it's a bunch of complicated stuff. He raised his fists and prepared to fight. I just wanted to be manlier, and that's so that I don't regret anything ever again. Is that so? Shoto allowed himself a bit of a smirk for once. Middle finger of fire it was. I'll have to ask you for some advice after this. The arena burst with dust, smoke, ice, and the battle cries of two passionate young men. Results. First place, Todoroki Shoto. Second place, Katsuki Bakugo. Third place, Fumikage Tokoyami. I thought you'd win against Shoto. Izuku sighed. Now I owe Denki 100 yen. You were the one who tired me out and revealed all my tricks beforehand. That I also may have motivated him to use his other half before your fight. Izuku felt two people trying to kill him with their gazes, one further down the hallway than the other. Traitor! Nerd! Greetings! It feels like summer is just around the corner. As for you, sir, I hope this letter finds you well. Since spring, I have been a teacher at UA High School and have taken on the task of guiding the next generation. Among these is the young man I have deemed worthy of inheriting my quirk, Kirishima Ijiro. He is passionate, greatly so, with all the positive, and unfortunately some of the negative qualities that I believe Nana saw in me. However, I am still inexperienced as a teacher. The day may come when I must trouble you, my old mentor. I am counting on you when that day comes. Additionally, we suspect that that man is not as dead as we had once thought. The Nomu, the beast that was briefly mentioned on television, was reported to have what appeared to be multiple quirks. As the partner of the previous holder of One for All, it was agreed that you would recognize his handiwork best. Nizu will provide the information on when this meeting will take place. As impulsive as ever. The elderly hero Gran Torino muttered as he flipped the letter over. But I suppose anything related to that man is a case that deserves attention. Addendum. I had hoped not to burden you further, but the principal insisted that we bring your great experience into our investigation. Oh. There is another boy who has caught my eye, and for different reasons that I hope do not lead to an undesirable outcome. Midoriya Izuku is an anomaly that even Nizu has struggled to unravel, and we suspect that he is connected to darker forces, either unwillingly or even unknowingly. Having your input would be greatly appreciated. What are you trying to get this old man into this time, Tashinori? Endeavor walked away from the sports festival feeling conflicted. On one hand, Shoto had finally started using his fire and dominated the competition as a result. On the other, he hadn't been using it the way that fire should be used. The quirk that he had inherited was a great offensive tool, and yet he insisted on relegating it to a supporting role to his ice, creating smokescreens and blockades, but never to directly attack. That role had been filled by his icy half, when it should have been the other way around. Perhaps this was yet another form of rebellion, a display that even though he acknowledged his fiery heritage, he would purposefully have it overshadowed by his ice in order to spite his father. Insolent. But he was improving. Another question was burning in his mind though, just who was that boy, Midoriya? As Eraserhead had pointed out, his son and his rivals, the students who had dominated the top ranks of the competition with overwhelming displays of power, had been avoiding him like the plague. In the first round he had been in the back for most of the race, yet he still cleared each obstacle with ease. And then there was the third round, where he dueled with the boy that he thought would be the greatest challenge to his son, displayed skill that could surpass fully trained pro heroes, and only lost by a desperate ring-out that no one had expected, from someone whose raw output fighting style was eerily similar to All Might's. Even that mentally exhausted Kirishima, who had played all his hidden cards and barely had time to recover between rounds, had put up a respectable fight against his son. It was clear why Izuku's peers acted the way they had around him. But a boy like that doesn't just come out of nowhere. The power of his quirk aside, to have that level of combat skill to begin with was abnormal. Was he simply a talented genius? Or was there something else to him? It seemed like someone else would be getting an invitation to Endeavor's agency this year. Good work, everybody. The still mummified form of Eraserhead mumbled. With the skills that all of you have shown in this festival, there will be many pro heroes who want to recruit you, but we'll consolidate all your offers and announce them when you get back. And because of that, there will be no school tomorrow and the day after. The crowd erupted with cheers at that knowledge, while Izuku just kept doodling more and more abnormalities into his sketchbook. He was on his third one at this point. Absent-mindedly, he glanced at the empty seat of Tenya Ida. It was a little off-putting to not hear the uptight boy yell at everyone to quiet down in respect of the school's peaceful environment, or something like that. He was well, and judging by the few worried glances sent that same way, his classmates thought the same. Wait, one of those was directed at him. Ashido Mina looked like a bottle of wine on the brink of bursting, looking back and forth between him and Aizawa jumpily, before she decided to bite the bullet. This has been bugging for the last few days. She pointed a finger at Izuku. Why did the Enomu kind of look like you? Izuku felt Aizawa's eyes widen in alarm through all the attention the class sent his way. He just shrugged, even he didn't know. It was a lot uglier than me. Well, yes I agree, but it fought the same way. Mina held out her hand and fired a non-acidic glob onto Mineta, who had activated his pervert mode the second she stood up. Hand blasts and meatball fist. I have absolutely no idea. Some sort of ungodly coincidence. That's enough. Aizawa interrupted with a bit more urgency than he probably wanted to show. I can tell that you aren't accusing each other, but you don't have to worry about the Nomu. It is being investigated by every type of doctor and detective that Nizu could hire. It didn't seem like enough to fully seal the can of worms that Mina had opened, but it was enough to contain them for now. Class dismissed. Rest well everyone. Getting to school after the sports festival was chaotic to say the least. Despite not placing high in the rankings, getting into the third round in the first place was enough for the general public to take notice of him, let alone those who got a front row seat to his fight with Eijiro. To avoid being swarmed by pedestrians, Izuku elected to temporarily inject his skin with more melanin and cover up his hair with a cap. He did meet Ida at the door, who seemed taken aback by Izuku's sudden tan skin before becoming even more shocked when he changed it back to his normal pale color, but aside from that, there were no other problems. Okay, maybe one, because Ida was intentionally putting on a facade over something. What that something was, Izuku wasn't sure, but there was undeniably something. Moving on, hero offers and name picking. Most eyes were on the top two, Bakugo and Shoto, for obvious reasons, but the others did get a few hundred options. Izuku's eyes moved down the list to see his own number, about 6, just below Eijiro's. They might have gone overboard during their match and scared off most of the agencies who would have taken them. He was too busy contemplating the oddities of how humans perceived power between different cases when a certain 18-plus heroine pranced in through the door and handed out a template whiteboard. The hero. Right, what should he call himself? Clearly, 06-20 was off the table, even if no one knew what that code even meant. The nickname, Flesh Dog, that he got from the employees would never fly either. So what could he pick? As Aizawa-sensei said, the name should be a concrete image of what he wanted to be in the future, but perfect mimic of a human was completely unacceptable. And even if he got the shell and personality completely perfect, he'd still never be human. All he could ever possibly be was a substitute. Yeah, that was right. That would always be right. All right, next up is Midoriya. Midnight flourished her whip at the green-haired boy. Come up and present your hero name to the class. Izuku walked up with his whiteboard and flipped it around. The board read, "Nothing there." The subtitle underneath read, "The placeholder," with the word hero behind it scribbled over. Midnight went full teacher mode in an instant. Absolutely not. We just told you about how your names should reflect who you want to be. Surely you want something more positive. It's fine. Izuku smiled, though it looked a little less bright than the usual one they had grown so used to. It's all I'll ever be. What? No one in the class had taken Izuku as a self-deprecating person. He had never shown himself to be a self-deprecating person. Not to mention exactly how illogical that title would be in comparison to his very noticeable fighting style. Off to the side, Bakugo shot a look at Aizawa, who shook his head while still pretending to be asleep. That I don't think I can stop you. Thankfully, this one is temporary. Midnight sighed as she reluctantly approved the name. But you better change it in the future. He wouldn't. That was practically his birth name. But at least the sentiment was appreciated. Okay, the looks of pity from his classmates were starting to get a bit annoying. Still, Izuku continued sifting through the few offers he had received, doing some research on who the heroes in question were on his phone. 3 were no-name agencies that probably just wanted to snag a promising candidate for their own reputation. One was endeavor, and while his position as the number 2 gave him a lot of value, the personality issues that Shoto had revealed knocked him down the list. One was Ryukyu, another top ranker, so he put that on top of the list for now. And the last one was Gran Torino. That name sounded familiar. Putting the name into the internet gave him an image of a short, yellow and white-clad gnome of an elderly man. Connecting a few dots, though those dots were far apart in some places, and Izuku decided on who he was going to intern with. Sorahiko. Nana, run. Is anyone down there? Anyone there? Time to meet an old acquaintance. Ijiro looked up at the dilapidated building in front of him, and back down at the address he was given. Then back up, and back down. This run-down dump was where Gran Torino, All Might's homeroom teacher who still scared him to this day, lived? Thought he'd live in a more normal-looking place. Oh yeah, there was also that to address. Why'd you choose to intern with this guy, Izuku? He asked the boy beside him. According to All Might, he'd mentioned both of them in a letter to Gran Torino, having not expected him to send a letter at all, which was probably why they were the only students to have even heard of the elderly hero. Ijiro sighed internally. They couldn't discuss One for All openly with Izuku around. I heard you got offers from Endeavor and Ryukyu. Endeavor is on my blacklist after everything Shoto said about him. Yeah, that made sense. He was tempted to punch the guy himself. As for Ryukyu, I just thought this guy was more interesting. More interesting than Ryukyu? Yeah. Seems like that was the end of that conversation. Since they weren't going to get anything done by standing around, he decided to push the door open, revealing a short old man lying on a pile of red liquid. He's dead. Ijiro yelled, while Izuku just stared. Said old man's head came up to look at them cheerfully. I'm alive. He's alive. Maintaining his act of senility as he wiped ketchup off his costume, Gran Torino watched the two students with curiosity and intrigue in his heart. So these were the two that Toshinori was so interested in. Who are you? He asked pleasantly, like a grandfather talking to his grandchildren. My name is Kirishima Ijiro. Midoriya Izuku. The pause. Who are you? Ijiro seemed to be rather taken aback by his performance, while Izuku stayed completely impassive, and actually seemed to be analyzing him when it should have been his job. It was a good quality to see in an aspiring hero, but it still made him a little uncomfortable, like he was facing that monster. He shoved those memories back into the recesses of his mind. I'm hungry. Ijiro nudged Izuku with his elbow to whisper to him. We should phone UA and tell them there's been a mistake. Instead of agreeing like the redhead seemed to expect, Izuku instead walked over to him and knelt down on one knee to speak with him on equal eye level. May I use your kitchen? Of course. Permission granted. Izuku placed his costume box on the nearby couch and rolled up his sleeves, glancing briefly at a dumbfounded Ijiro as he went to the kitchen. I doubt a hero would leave an old man in need, he said simply before wandering further into the house. Good, the student not in the know was out of the way, thought it felt a bit like he was playing along. No matter. Now they could get down to business. Ijiro sighed as he watched Izuku vanish further into the house. Sure, giving help where it was clearly needed was the manly thing to do, but surely he was missing something? UA wouldn't have accepted an internship offer from a senile old man, would I? His instincts screamed to life as something incredibly fast rocketed towards him out of the corner of his eye, and Ijiro raised a hardened arm to block a kick from the same old man he thought was senile. Not bad. Gran Torino grinned as he kicked off of Ijiro and landed, looking far more spry now that he'd given up the act. Now, put on your costume. I want to see for myself just how well you can handle One for All. Cracking his knuckles, Ijiro felt a grin of his own come onto his face. Now this was more like it. Izuku hummed a song to himself as he rummaged through Gran Torino's fridge, the sound of combat in the background adding a sort of chaos that only he would consider soothing. It didn't seem like the old man had anything in his fridge to cook, so that was the end of that plan. Anyways, it seemed like despite the fact he had lost most of his height, Gran Torino was doing well, not too far from his performance in his younger years. How long ago had it been when they met? Around when he had first arrived in this world decades ago, in that dark bunker facility, quite a lot of time to reminisce on. He stepped back into the first room to see it in shambles, with a number of new cracks lining the walls. Some were reminiscent of the shockwaves from Eijiro's punches, while others were more like imprints where something solid landed. Lying on the ground was a tired, but seemingly pleased Eijiro, and the old man was nowhere to be seen. "I take it you didn't make any mistakes after all?" Eijiro gave him a tired thumbs up. As the trio boarded a train to Hosu, Gran Torino couldn't help but compliment Toshinori for the first time in a long while. He had chosen one hell of a successor. Eijiro wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, but certainly sharp enough to complement his abilities, as well as durable enough to make time for plans and retaliations in the middle of combat. It hadn't taken long for him to learn to use one for all throughout his body, and the enhancements provided by his original hardening quirk synergized wonderfully with the quirk's power boost. He was promising, and a student that made him consider being a teacher again. Izuku, on the other hand, he wasn't bad in any way. Personality-wise, he was respectful and pleasant to speak with, and his true combat skills were impossible to gauge, keeping up with the enhanced Eijiro with the same ease he had shown during the sports festival. Gran Torino, however, had never fought the boy himself despite doing so with Eijiro, because he couldn't look at Izuku without seeing that thing from back then. Could he be? No, that was impossible. Quirks that could defy the ravages of time were incredibly rare, and someone like All for One would never waste such a quirk on a weapon when it was better used elsewhere. Besides, the entire structure had collapsed in on itself, and there hadn't been any reports that could possibly be about the thing in years. The one he saw that day had to be gone. But if Izuku really was some sort of successor to whatever twisted creation of All for Ones that was he even aware of it himself? Why'd you give yourself such a demoralizing hero name, anyways? Izuku turned to look at Gran Torino as an exhausted Eijiro laid on the floor. Calling yourself nothing there the placeholder, don't you know the more you get called something, the more likely you become like it as time goes on? It's just how it is, sir. Izuku's face morphed into a smiling one like it was some sort of default. I don't see myself becoming anything more than that, and that's fine. Really? 'Cause you don't look fine with it. Izuku immediately pressed his hands against his face, as if searching for imperfections, before looking in the mirror, still smiling the whole way through. What are you talking about? I'm fine. See? He traced the arc with his fingers, and it sharpened upwards slightly as he did so. Nice big smile. Whatever this boy was, he needed some help. There was more to emotions than what one showed on their face, and right now, Izuku gave him the feeling that he was in fact not fine with his foregone conclusion. Izuku tapped his finger against the window of the train as they approached Hosu. Last he heard, Ito was heading here too, so maybe they'd get to meet up. That'd be a night. He frowned at the sounds of muttering passengers, before the entire train shook as something slammed its way in. Instantly, he raised his hand and fired a shard of bone into the shoulder of the Noma-like being, coated in a potent paralytic poison. Given that heroes weren't expected to kill, he'd spent quite some time developing that poison. It had put down a human in an instant to avoid property damage and unnecessary blood loss. The Nomu swayed like a drunkard and fell down onto the floor of the train, scrabbling drowsily to get itself out. It seemed the dosage would have to be higher to knock it out completely, something to note for the next. Oh, wait. Permission for quirk usage, sir? He asked Gran Torino, slipping a touch of L Corp agent into the question. He'd forgotten about that little rule, best to ask now. Pa, asking for permission after doing the deed? Even as he said that, though, Gran Torino grinned with approval in his eyes. You can't move on your own yet without a provisional license, but if either of you just so happen to take down another Nomu while sticking by my side, then I'll handle any concerns the police have. It wasn't the one I'd planned, but consider this our excursion. With that said, the elderly hero rocketed out of the train car, taking the greatly debilitated Nomu with him as he did so, followed closely behind by Eijiro and Izuku, who had no problems keeping up thanks to their extreme physical enhancement quirks. As they leapt over the rooftops of the city, Izuku noticed a familiar figure standing atop a building's water tower. Gran Torino! He yelled at the elderly hero, who had dropped off the Nomu in front of a couple other heroes, pointing in the direction of Tamura Shigaraki. Villains spotted in the distance. Their mentor narrowed his eyes in that direction, before they widened in recognition. Shigaraki! Ijiro was trying to get Ida's location from the hero he was supposed to be in, turning under, manual, and deflected a blow from the muscular Nomu as it tried to attack the hero, who was busy putting out the fires. Kirishima! Assist the heroes here, and follow their instructions. Gran Torino ordered as he rocketed upwards, Izuku following close behind as they approached Tamura. The boy raised his hand in preparation to fight, but took an instinctual step back as he realized who was right behind the elderly hero. Kurojairi! He shrieked, his assistant already conjuring a portal to escape through long before the duo reached them, and the two fled before combat could begin. Tisk! Gran Torino hissed as the two vanished into thin air. Thought he'd be more impressive than that. Izuku stared at the spot where the villains stood for a while. His reaction had been quite different than last time, and not in the way that a human normally reacted when they were afraid of something. He had seen enough of that in the corporation, the difference between first-hand and second-hand fear, and that was clearly second-hand. He was scared because someone had told him to be, not because he truly was. The question was, who was the one he answered to? Who was his manager? The sight of a glacier bursting from a nearby alleyway cut those thoughts short. Stain the hero killer sneered as the red and white-haired boy blocked off the entire alleyway with a mountain of ice. That attack would have drawn far too much attention from the other pro-heroes in the area. If he was to continue his work, he would have to leave, and he dodged as a short old man tried to slam him into the pavement, proving his hunch correct, and started to make his escape, leaping up the sides of the buildings. Izuku! The hero yelled upwards, and Stain was met with the sight of a young boy charging at him. Another so-called hero in training. He snarled, drawing his sword. One cut would be all he needed. He raised the blade. And this Izuku vanished from his sight, followed closely by the pain of a brutal strike slamming into his gut, the boy punching him long before he could swing his blade. Stain staggered back as he wiped the bile forced out of him from his lips. So, what's your deal? Izuku asked nonchalantly as he approached, unable to beat the sheet out of him without getting closer. Why go through all this trouble, Mr. Hero Killer? Because this society is plagued. He howled, flinging a trio of knives at Izuku, who batted them aside without a scratch. Filled with heroes who act not to save others, but on their own desires, for fame, for money, for revenge. I fight to retake the true meaning of a hero, for those who are true heroes, pure of heart. He lunged forwards, and was once again utterly outmaneuvered by Izuku, his blade cutting nothing but air. For those who live to serve peace, deliver justice, and help those in need, even at the cost of their own lives. That's a little silly. Izuku replied as he slammed his knee into Stain's side, followed up by disarming the hero killer with a swat of his hand. To err is human, so the saying goes, and so is to have desires and wants. A being that can act without desire doesn't exist. Stain pushed himself to stand defiantly, and Izuku simply watched. All acts, heroic or not, are born from selfish desires. To save someone, you have to first decide that they need your help, and to feel relieved that they're safe because of you is just another form of self-satisfaction to stave off the fear as the life leaves your body. Desires are a fundamental thing that makes humans what they are. You can't just cut them out, and it's more ridiculous to say the same about simple self-preservation. You're deluded just like the rest of them. A faker who perpetuates the cycle of false heroes. Izuku just shrugged. Maybe I am. Maybe if you were the first person to teach me, my perspective would be different, and I don't think I'd mind that. You're quite the change of pace. But to maintain the peace that I and so many others have grown used to, I'll be taking you down here and now. I hope you don't mind that selfish desire. Stain was out of tricks, out of weapons, and out of strength, with no way to escape this absolute monster of a boy who, begrudgingly, had a minuscule fragment of a point, that much he could admit. Regardless, he held up his fists to fight for as long as he could. I'll commend you for following through on those words, Boy, that's better than most fakes I've seen. Izuku raised his hand, and Stain felt something sharp puncture his skin, before his sight went woozy, and he fell to his side, the world going dark. Goodbye, Stain. 2 days after the incident, Izuku found himself back in UA before most of the other students. While it was unofficially recognized that he and Ijiro had contributed substantially to the defeat of the Nomu, particularly when Ijiro sent the strongest one flying with a good punch from One for All, and anyone in the know had been thankful for their contributions, they hadn't fully escaped the law. With Gran Torino's teaching license revoked, that left them without a hero to intern under for the rest of the week, so he and Ijiro had returned to their school for the rest of the week. Stain the hero killer. Truly, humans were fascinating to have such drastically different viewpoints and philosophies from one another. Every day, he learned something new and admirable. Such things as ideologies were yet another reason he would never truly be human. Izuku felt the curves of his smile, the most common expression he had learned to mimic other than his impassive stare, and the one he defaulted to the most, turn less sharply than they used to. Odd, he hadn't introduced any variable factors into his face, given he was the only one present. And what was this faint discomfort in his chest that he felt, yet couldn't pinpoint? Nizu beamed as the door to his office opened. Ah, so nice to meet you again, Gran Torino. Don't think I've forgotten about the things you put me through as a teacher, Nizu. The old man huffed as he walked in, surveying who was present, those being All Might in his deflated form, and Detective Tsukachi. As for you, Tashinori, you've done slightly better than I expected. Thank you, sensei. Now then, where's that Nomu you wanted to show me so much? Nizu activated a hologram projector, and Gran Torino glanced at the image to see. He fought back a gasp as he laid eyes on that familiar sight, and All Might transformed in an instant, rushing over to support the hyperventilating old man. What's wrong, sensei? Gran Torino brushed away All Might's arms as he got his ancient trauma in check. Something didn't line up here. Why does it look worse? What do you mean? Nizu inquired, and he gave Tashinori a look. His student never liked talking about Nana for long, with all the painful memories that name was associated with, but he'd have to bear it for now. I fought something similar with Nana back in the day. All Might inhaled sharply at the revelation that both of his teachers had encountered something like the Nomu before. We'd located one of All for One's hideouts, and thought it'd be a crippling blow to his criminal empire if we attacked it. Decades ago, Gran Torino and the seventh holder of One for All, Nana Shimura, descended into an underground laboratory, which according to their efforts, contained a large portion of All for One's assets. They'd already beaten down a swarm of villains on the way, none able to stand against them and their quirks, and they thought there wouldn't be any further difficulties. It was odd though. The villains seemed to be less so coming out to combat them, and more so running from something inside, only engaging with the heroes because they had no other choice. As they went in further, everything had been silent. Perhaps too silent for the interior of an all-for-one run facility, which should have been teeming with hired villains and the occasional morally bankrupt scientist. Help me. The duo suddenly heard a scientist beg, their legs utterly decimated into paste as they crawled forwards, hand outstretched and their face contorted in fear and agony. Please dash. A red foot stomped onto his back, plunging right through and crushing what working organs the scientist had left. Standing over him was what could only be described as an abomination, a creature that only barely resembled a human, constructed from pulsing red muscle without skin. Eyes were littered all across its form, while misshapen organs drooped from a hole in its torso. One arm was a sharp, clawed hand, and the other ended in a meatball-like mace with bone fragments jutting from it. The thing took notice of them immediately, walking slowly and deliberately as each eye flitted over the two of them like a security camera. Neither hero stood around. Clearly, this was one of All for One's weapons gone rogue. Gran Torino was the first to deal a blow on the creature, slamming his boot into its face. The exchange did not go as he had expected. The creature didn't even react, and it felt like he'd kicked a brick wall, pain shooting up his leg from the impact. Torino! He heard Nana yell from behind him, no doubt reacting to his pained expression. Gran Torino activated his jets again, barely avoiding a lazy swipe from the creature, and the hero felt a grin creep onto his face as Nana approached, her fist reeled back for a punch. Powered by One for All, Nana's strikes were unmatched in strength among the quirked world, and that all power went right into the creature's incomplete torso. The shockwave shook the halls, and it shuddered from the impact, but once again it didn't move, completely unaffected by the impact. Instead, the ground beneath it shattered as if a bomb had gone off. Did it redirect that entire impact from its torso to the ground beneath it? Whatever the reason was, Nana's shock slowly turned to fear as the beast loomed over her, and with something like a laugh coming from its malformed windpipe, the beast took its own swing. "Nana, run!" Though she brought up both arms to block, a sickening crack sounded out as she went flying into the wall, her bones painfully dislocated from that single blow. Nana had never been this injured by a criminal other than All for One since she mastered One for All, and Gran Torino felt panic enter his heart as the monster started moving again, towards Nana as she clutched her damaged arm. "Is anyone down there? Anyone there?" It screeched in a voice that was certainly not its own. He gulped down as much air as he could and pushed his quirk to its limits, snatching Nana from out of harm's way as the monster's fist came down like a wrecking ball, demolishing the place where she had stood. He kept going even as his lungs gasped for air that he couldn't provide, rocketing both of them out of the structure and to the surface, away from that unstoppable killing machine. Not long after the two laid on the ground, a deafening boom sounded out from deep within the structure, and it collapsed in on itself. No doubt it had crushed anyone who was still inside, but with everyone who had fled at the start, but the two didn't have the mental capability to process that at that moment, their minds preoccupied with the lethality of the beast they had narrowly escaped. Their enemy had created something strong enough to defeat the bearer of One for All without difficulty, and the only bright side seemed to be that he couldn't control it himself. Whether that was better or not, they didn't know. Days passed, which turned to weeks and then months. No traces of the monster were ever found. It had vanished into thin air, or was crushed in the rubble of the building. Whatever its fate was, Gran Torino hoped he'd never see it again for as long as he lived. But if it did one day resurface, he prayed that Toshinori would be capable of defeating the thing his predecessor couldn't. Gran Torino let the implications of his story sink in. If All for One could make something so dangerous back in my youth, then why has this modern version seemingly regressed? Nizu finished. That brings me to the other thing. About Midoriya Dash. Bearing similar traits to the Nomu. Tsukachi interrupted, an apologetic look on his face as the old man glared at him, holding up his hands in surrender. "I was only informed about this myself before you arrived. We had gotten some details about the USJ from interrogating the students of 1A, but not a single one of them mentioned this similarity in both fighting style and physical appearance until recently, only that he had undergone a transformation and killed it with ease." According to Eraserhead, this connection was brought up by Ishido Mina, one of the few students who directly saw Midoriya Izuku's battle with the Nomu. That leads us to our current hypothesis. Nizu chirped as he switched the hologram on display to 3 labeled boxes, somewhat like a comic book, the second one showing an arrow and a question mark. Nizu directed attention to the first, showing Izuku and the sludge villain. During the sludge villain incident, All Might encountered Midoriya Izuku, who he revealed his secret to Dash. Nizu didn't miss the way that All Might literally and figuratively shriveled under Gran Torino's look of disbelief. On accident, as the boy had clung to his pants leg. On the roof of a building, Izuku confessed his dream to be a hero, to which All Might reluctantly told him that he should aim to be a policeman instead, as he was quirkless and therefore at risk should he continue pursuing this dream. Once again, Gran Torino glared at All Might, though this time, it seemed more personal. A few days later, while training Kirishima Eijiro to receive One for All, All Might encountered Izuku again, who had noticeably changed in personality, closer to the one that we know today. The boy was going with his mother to register his quirk, which had recently developed, and Midoriya Inko displayed signs of distress after All Might recounted the aforementioned events of their meeting. Through some digging into his middle school records, those present couldn't help but think he had pulled some legally dubious strings. It turns out that just the day after the incident, Inko called the school saying that Izuku had experienced an emergency health problem and a few days later withdrew him entirely. No other records, aside from his quirk registration, were made up until his participation in UA's entrance exam. Additionally, police records provided by Detective Tsukachi state that Inko reported that her son was missing on the same day of the incident, and Izuku was recovered by the police that night, with a number of wounds and damaged clothing. The chain of events was clear. That means that in those few days between the sludge villain incident and All Might meeting Izuku at the beach, the boy developed a quirk for unknown reasons after years of quirklessness. Nizu concluded, rubbing his paws together at the thought of solving such an interesting puzzle. If your story is to be believed, Gran Torino, and that All for One still has the ability to create the being you saw that day, then it's possible that he abducted Izuku sometime after his meeting with All Might, and turned him into the Izuku we know now through likely immoral experimentation. There were a few shivers throughout the room at that. Knowing how evil All for One was, there was no way any experiments of his would be painless. Then, just like his predecessor, Izuku proved to be uncontrollable and escaped, leading to the authorities finding him and returning him to his mother that night. Nizu continued. With the quirk unintentionally gifted to him by All for One, he was then able to enroll in UA, just as he had dreamed. Meanwhile, seeing his efforts to recreate the lethal weapon that had gone rogue years ago fail once more, All for One settled for a weaker but more loyal creation instead, which was later slain by Izuku at the USJ. The mouse chuckled as he finished up his hypothesis. What lends credence to this theory is that according to a recording from when the students were on their way back from the USJ-right, Nizu was the type of mouse to put cameras and recording devices on or in every single thing the students might touch if he could help it. Izuku described the being as disgusting and showed no shock or remorse at taking its life, suggesting he had seen something similar before. Of course, there's still many gaps that remain empty. What connection does Midoriya Inko have with all this? Are either of the Midoriyas aware that All for One is more than a simple criminal with a penchant for human experimentation? Why did Izuku come back with a different personality? And most importantly, how could Izuku have been experimented on and escaped in the span of a few hours? Gran Torino jabbed a distraught-looking All Might with his cane. Quit moping, Toshinori. Stupid as you were to crush a boy's dreams, you couldn't have predicted if All for One would take him. I still failed young Midoriya that day, sensei. Whether or not Nizu is correct, my words clearly had an impact on him. Tsukachi gave his friend a pat on the back, before looking at Nizu. I suppose this is where you want me to come in? Certainly. The mouse chirped. You're the only one among us who can keep a low profile, so we'll be leaving this investigation in your hands, detective. The detective exhaled. Alright, he could work with this. Tomorrow he'd pay a visit to the Midoriya household. The many teachers of UA crowded around a table in a dark room, its surface littered with 20 upside-down cards to hide their contents. So, once more for confirmation. Nizu chirped from the center of the table. Do you solemnly agree that regardless of the outcome, there will be no attempts to escape the fate you have been consigned to? The teachers nodded, grabbing 2 cards each from the pile, and Nizu revealed his first. Clear, he said cheerfully, and the teachers sighed. How is this the most stressful thing they've done so far? USJ excluded for Aizawa and 13. Izuku couldn't stop his eyes from roaming while he was changing in the locker room with the rest of the boys out of interest. Not that kind of interest. It was just rare that he got to observe humans without clothing on, and why were they staring at him? Did he overstep a social boundary he was unaware of or something? His eyes trailed down where the horrified expressions pointed and crap. So, somehow, Izuku had managed to avoid actually changing his clothes in front of people for the multiple months he'd been Izuku. Actually, he'd never changed in front of people in any of his previous shells, now that he thought about it. He just layered his hero costume over his uniform whenever they had hero training, since he didn't mind the feeling of double-layered clothing. The only reason he had done so today of all days was because he wanted to give it a try, having accidentally torn a bit of his uniform while interning under Gran Torino, as it was far less flexible than his costume was. The problem? Because all of his previous shells had been decent up until the point where he had to abandon them, he may have neglected to properly repair Izuku's covered-up parts, as the materials required were better stored for use on more exposed parts like the limbs and head. So the second he took his shirt off, Izuku flashbanged the rest of the boys in the room with a torso that was about 70% hastily constructed scar tissue so that his organs didn't fall out. Hitting the pavement after gathering velocity from falling off the top of a building does wonders in shredding the human body's softer parts. Clearly, he couldn't just heal it on the spot. He'd already given them the impression that he would have done that a long time ago. In fact, they'd probably come to the conclusion that it was the only wound he couldn't heal in the short few seconds they'd seen it for. The solution: play it off as normal as he put on his costume with haste. Don't stare. The class's authority figure in terms of scars, Shoto said. Ida nodded beside him. The lesson starts in 5 minutes. We have no time to waste. Spurred on by the class's unofficial vice president, the students tore their eyes away and quickly got ready for the lesson. Izuku let out a whistle in relief. That was close. Oh, and the rescue training was rather basic, not much to say there. Izuku did make sure to duck out of sight when changing his clothes again though. Finally, the practical half of the final exams arrived and, honestly, Izuku would have preferred fighting the robots again. It was more fun to fight humans, sure, since they each had their own specialties and adaptability, but getting to let loose was more satisfying for him. And one more thing. Midoriya. Kirishima. The two boys perked up at the mention of their names. You two in particular will be fighting a pair of pros. Remind me why we're singling out these two listeners again? Present Mike asked as the ritual to decide on who would die continued. Because only a select few pros can outlast or find a way around Eijiro's hardening, and getting Izuku to do so much as flinch just becomes more and more difficult to imagine each time he does so much as move, to the point we're unsure whether or not even All Might would win if the two were on the same team, so we're sacrificing 2 of us to fight them. Eraserhead replied as he revealed his own cards. Clear. The hero who was up next, Midnight, flipped her cards and slammed her head into the table at the sight of a bold black X. That's one. Nizu cackled as the remaining teachers shivered. There was still one more among them who would suffer that fate. Looking like they were already dead, Midnight and Power Loader raised their hands in resignation. Teams. First match, Cementos, weightless, vs Rikido Sato, Bakugo Katsuki and Tenya Ida. Second match, Ectoplasm vs Fumikage Tokoyami and Tsuyu Azui. Third match, Eraserhead, weightless, vs Shoto Todoroki and Momo Yaoyorozu. Fourth match, 13, weightless, vs Yuga Oyama, Achiko Uraraka and Minoru Mineta. Fifth match, Nizu vs Denki Kaminari, Masahiro Ojiro and Mina Ishido. Sixth match, Present Mike, weightless, vs Kyoka Jiro, Hantasiro and Koji Koda. Seventh match, Snipe vs Mizo Shoji and Toru Hagakure. Eighth match, Midnight and Power Loader, both weightless, vs Izuku Midoriya and Eijiro Kirishima. Where's All Might? Eijiro asked, finding no sign of his mentor. Do you really want All Might to terrorize a group of children? Nizu replied, and Eijiro put down his hand in fear of making that a reality. Inko was going about her day peacefully when she heard a knock at the door. Standing there was a skeletal husk of a man and Detective Tsukachi. Good morning, Miss Midoriya, the detective said, tipping his hat to her. Are you busy at the moment? No, of course not. Inko slipped into a facade of hospitality when in reality she was panicking inside. Why was there a detective coming to her house? She hadn't done anything illegal, and neither had Izuku. She had explicitly taught him to avoid being chased by the law by giving him an entire law book, and he'd remembered each clause in it like they were sacred in just an afternoon. Please come in. She hastily went about brewing some tea for her impromptu guests as they settled down in the living room. What brings you here, detective? Tsukachi happily accepted his cup of tea, seemingly unsure of how to proceed before he cleared his throat. You see, Miss Midoriya, it has to do with your son. Seeing her flinch, he hastily added, not that he's done anything illegal. In fact, we fear he may be a victim. Inko instantly relaxed. She still looked a little concerned. Does it have something to do with the villains from the USJ or Hosu? And please, Inko is fine. Tsukachi nodded. Very well, Miss Inko. Yes, those villains are involved, but it goes a bit deeper than simple villainy. Do you know anything that happened to Izuku on the day the sludge villain incident occurred? Inko instantly looked like a woman on trial, taking an involuntary step back. Detective I-. He raised his hand placatingly, cutting her off. My quirk can detect if you're lying or not, and what you just said was a lie. But rest assured, we aren't here to arrest anyone. Understanding what happened to Midoriya Izuku that day is so that we can protect him better from those who would wish to harm him. He glanced at his skeletal accomplice, who took a deep breath, and in a puff of smoke, grew into all might on her sofa, almost pushing the detective over with how much space he was suddenly taking up. I am here, he said more softly than he normally would, likely because they didn't want others overhearing. Inko, as should be expected, was stunned by shock that All Might actually looked like that when not being a hero. Her shock cleared, however, as she took in the look of guilt that was present in place of the hero's perpetual grin. And I am sorry. Not only did I shatter his dream, I failed to protect your son that day from true evil. He clenched his oversized fist. All I can do is hope that I can make things right. What? We believe that your son was kidnapped and experimented on by an ancient villain that should have been long gone, defeated by All Might years ago. Tsukachi explained. Capable of giving and taking quirks, it's possible that he was the reason your son suddenly gained one. We also believe that he escaped that villain, after which he was found by the police and returned to you that night. Can you provide us with any information you have on the days following his return? Inko clutched the empty tray to her chest as her legs gave out, trembling with fear and sorrow. You can't, please, she flinched as All Might offered her a hand. You don't need to be afraid, the giant said gently as he attempted to calm her down. That man cannot touch you as long as we're around. Inko sniffled, holding her hands over her eyes and attempting to hold back her tears. You can't help him. I promise that I will. All Might's eyes burned with the desire to make things right. We will do everything in our power to ensure that that man can cause no further harm to Aiza. Izuku is dead. Inko shrieked, wrenching the words from the grief-filled bottom of her heart. That fire was snuffed out instantly by the chill that blanketed the room, disbelief freezing both All Might and Tsukachi in place as they processed what Inko had said, the woman wailing on the floor. What? All Might looked at the broken woman on the floor, currently in the process of flooding her house. He looked back at Detective Tsukachi and saw the man equally as pale as his own face felt. He looked back at Inko again, and stuck a finger in his ear to make sure it was nice and clear. Nope, he wasn't hallucinating or mistaking anything. Those were the cries of a devastated mother. Then he looked back at Tsukachi again. Did you hear that correctly? He said with a bit too much concern in his voice for his own liking. The detective nodded. It's true. His friend's lie detection quirk could be fooled if the person being questioned genuinely believed what they were saying was true, but Izuku was clearly alive, at least in a literal sense. To even enter UA in the first place, he would have to been here with Inko when his letter was delivered. There was no way the woman could have believed that Izuku was dead if the two had been living together for months after the incident. Don't worry. I'm just going to take over your body. All Might's mouth felt like a desert. It wasn't the sludge villain, that was for sure, but what if something else had taken control of the boy's body when he was alone? It would explain everything. His sudden development of a quirk, his change in personality, his disappearance in those couple of hours. But then how did All for One and the Being Gran Torino saw tie into this? Why didn't Inko report anything to the police? And why would Izuku go through the trouble of applying to UA of all places? All Might push those thoughts aside. First things first, deal with the grieving woman in front of him. He took a step from the couch, intending to help the woman up like he did before, only for her to snap her head towards him, her eyes burning with grief and hatred. Inko swung her hand, and All Might found himself buffeted by an invisible force, while the table, couch, and Tsukachi were all blown over with a cry. She raised her hand again, and her eyes widened as she realized what she was doing, her limb instantly going limp as she stared despondently at the floor. "I'm sorry." All Might knelt next to her. "You're grieving, Miss Inko. You don't have to apologize." Inko sniffled, craning her head up slightly to stare at a picture of her and her son on the wall, smiling like it was the happiest day of their lives, forcing out her confession between her teary breaths for air. "That he came back that night, and I thought everything was fine. Then, I don't even know, told me he dash." The mother trembled as she recounted that horrible day, clutching her chest with both arms. That Izuku was already dash. The firm hand of All Might settled on her shoulder, warm and comforting. "You don't have to say it if it hurts." Inko nodded, most of her tears having been exhausted as she continued in a low whisper. "That I shouldn't have considered it for even a second, but I couldn't let him go, so I asked if he could be Izuku for me." Tsukachi, who had picked himself up, looked incredibly disturbed by all this new information. For a single mother to have to hear about her son's death from someone, or even something else that had taken on his identity, and have no one else know. "If I may ask, did he tell you anything else?" All Might asked, and the look in Inko's eyes was unfortunately enough to tell him that she thought it had hurt him as well before she opened her mouth. "He said Izuku had taken a swan dive, off a dash." The grief of that last word was too much, as Inko broke down in hacking coughs, but it was enough to shock All Might into deflating, looking more horrified than he'd ever been in his life. "It couldn't be. I cannot simply say, you can become a hero even without great power." He had crushed the dreams of a quirkless boy, and left him on top of a building without supervision. Her anger was justified. "Please, don't take him away." Inko swayed like a withering leaf. "He's tried so hard," and collapsed, barely being caught by Tsukachi, who looked at his friend with a grim expression. She would be admitted to a hospital later that day to treat her rapidly deteriorating health due to extreme stress. Back over at UA, Midnight and Power Loader were making plans on how to stop Ijiro and Izuku from getting past them. It was rather ironic, really. "I feel like a student again." Midnight lifelessly chuckled as her youth at you flashed before her eyes. Power Loader nodded in agreement as he mapped out his digging routes to create pitfalls with. Considering their quirks, the two of them may very well be the only ones capable of taking down one as pair of immovable objects. Consider it our training, I guess. It's not just the students who have to become stronger. I get that, but did it have to be like this? What do you think Midnight and Power Loader have planned? Izuku asked as he and Ijiro entered the arena after a leisurely time of watching the others take their exams. "Who knows?" Ijiro grinned confidently in return as he cracked his knuckles. "But as long as we break any traps they make, then we're good." If anyone else said that, excluding myself, Aizawa-sensei, Yaoyorozu and Ida would prepare a 10-minute speech each on the importance of planning. Izuku laughed as they stepped into the dirt field. The exit had been removed because they simply couldn't be prevented from beelining to it, so their only option to win was to capture their teachers, and where it used to be was where Midnight now stood, whip in tightly clenched hand as if she was the one being tested. The speakers lining the arena crackled to life with Nizu's voice. "The exam begins now." Instantly, the ground began to buckle and shake, before a massive pit opened beneath the duo, courtesy of Power Loader's digging. If there was one thing they couldn't do, it was defy gravity, and they went plummeting down, Ijiro yelling something around the lines of, "Setting a trap before a battle is unmanly." Midnight capitalized on this by ripping both of her sleeves, and allowing her quirk to blanket the hole, pink smoke filling it up like a collapsing coal mine. Midnight stood over the hole, making sure that every possible nook and cranny was filled with her gas by pouring in as much as she could, while Power Loader and his digging suit popped out of the ground beside her. Can you imagine going this far against any other group of students? The excavator-themed hero asked, wearing a gas mask under his helmet to protect him from his colleagues' gas. "It feels a little rude to have them start in a trap." The sound of rocks and stones being disturbed drew the hero's attention back to the hole, as a glowing Ijiro flew out and landed close to them. He took in a deep breath, and before Midnight's gas could put him to sleep, slapped himself hard enough to cause both heroes to wince, accompanied by a horrid sound akin to scraping a chalkboard. The redhead turned towards them, unable to speak because he was holding his breath, probably mumbling something about manliness, before he launched himself forwards. Power Loader ducked back beneath the ground like a whack-a-mole, leaving Midnight out to dry as Ijiro clotheslined her. Resurfacing to see if he could help her in any way, Power Loader suddenly felt his entire suit being pulled out of the ground, and turned to see Izuku smiling pleasantly right into his face, breathing fine in the gas-filled environment. Hello. Ah, crap. Nizu watched the expected outcome play out on the screens, as Midnight and Power Loader were quickly dispatched. Their trap would have worked on most students, but it turned out that Ijiro gained intelligence whenever he was in combat, and Izuku was capable of shifting his biology to filter out the gas. Or at least that was what Nizu thought before he zoomed in on Izuku, finding something far weirder. Minuscule parts of the boy's skin were disintegrating and regenerating rapidly while in the gas. The principal couldn't make any sense of it. Regardless, it was clear that the two had passed, not that anyone had expected them to fail. I hope all might return soon. He mused to himself as the students left the school in various states, some pleased with their performance, others shambling like zombies at the thought of missing out on summer camp. Perhaps Midoriya Inko will grant me that final puzzle piece I need. That I must still have dust in my ears from the exam. Nizu laughed as Toshinori sat in front of him, looking the farthest he'd ever been from the symbol of peace. Because if what I heard was correct, then Midoriya Izuku is a walking corpse. That's, unfortunately, approximately what we were told by Midoriya Inko. Tsukachi said, and Nizu deflated in his chair. There were very few things that Nizu would admit he hated, but receiving an answer that wasn't something he would be pleased to know was definitely one of them. That complicates things greatly. Apparently, after receiving well-intentioned but ultimately heartbreaking advice from All Might, Midoriya Izuku had thrown himself off a multi-story building, and something else took control of his body specifically to deliver the news to his mother. Midoriya Inko proceeded to beg Izuku, as they currently knew him, to substitute her son in order to stave off the grief and loneliness, which he accepted, and after living with her for months, eventually ended up in UA. This wasn't a simple case of exposing a villain for impersonating a young boy. To the world at large, and particularly Class 1A sans Bakugo, was Midoriya Izuku, a freakishly powerful yet polite and pleasant hero student, and always had been. Hell, the person who had been affected the most spent her last moments conscious begging for them to not take him away. How was he supposed to react to this? How was anyone supposed to react to this? So, let me get this straight. In summary, we potentially have a monster from long before the modern era, strong enough to single-handedly defeat a monster engineered by the boogeyman of villain society to kill All Might, and with the blood of an unknown number of people on its hands, posing as a student that has attended UA for months. However, not only has he shown no desire to cause harm during his stay, but he has actively cultivated relationships both in and outside of UA, and seems to actively avoid bloodshed if his performance in the training lessons and sports festival are anything to go by, therefore contradicting Gran Torino's description of his behavior. Is this correct? Seems like it. Well then. Nizu sighed as he ran dozens of plans through his mind at once. First, under no circumstances can we reveal this to the public. UA would be hit with a scandal like no other, if it was revealed that we've had a wolf in the sheep pen for months. Additionally, doing so could cause Izuku to become hostile, and if Gran Torino's fears are true, the damage that would cause would be catastrophic. Second, even if that didn't happen, I fear that exposing Izuku would negatively impact many members of Class 1A. To be forced to discover that one of their closest friends is in truth an inhuman being that may or may not have been plotting to murder them the whole time will not go over well in the slightest. And finally, I doubt any of us want to see him gone, do we? Then what do we do? Toshinori asked quietly from the chair he was about to break his spine on, with how far back he was leaning. For the first time in a long while, Nizu was stuck with a problem that he couldn't solve in the foreseeable future. What indeed? Midoriya, can you stay for a little longer? Izuku tilted his head as the rest of his classmates filtered out of the room. What's the problem, Aizawa-sensei? Aizawa sighed. It was never easy to explain news like this, no matter how many times he'd seen similar occurrences. It's about your mother. She was hospitalized a few hours ago due to emergency health conditions. As she didn't have any close relatives, most notably your absent father, Principal Nizu decided that for now, you'll be residing on campus. Ah. Izuku replied, and Aizawa couldn't help but notice he had slipped back into his impassive expression. Aren't you concerned about your mother's health? Nope. The response was cheerful, a direct and somewhat uncanny contrast to how he looked, and Aizawa's brow furrowed further. She'll be fine, I'm sure. You don't look like it. Izuku paused and slowly pressed his hands against his face, feeling over it before pausing, then again and again, his hands moving more frantically each time while his expression remained still. Why can't I smile? He heard the boy mutter to himself. But, why? His hands moved quickly and with surgical precision, attempting to force his facial muscles into the shape they should be, an upwards curve on both sides of his lips, yet they never remained in that desired shape. His rhetorical question repeated like a broken record as every attempt proved fruitless. Why dash. Midoriya. The boy froze, looking the most lost he'd ever been as he looked up at Aizawa. I don't know what you're going through, but it's not healthy to push everything down and do nothing but smile. Aizawa stepped to the door, before glancing back at Izuku. Follow me. I'll take you to your room. Silently, Izuku nodded and followed him. Aizawa mentally sighed as he walked down the halls of UA in the setting sun. It's always something new with you, isn't it, problem child? Summer camp, a concept completely foreign to Izuku. Why did humans specifically choose to have holidays in the summer? And why did this only apply to ones who were in school? In any other circumstance, Izuku would have been greatly interested in learning about this strange human tradition. And yet he wasn't. His mind kept wandering back to Inko, who had suddenly fallen ill. She would most likely be fine. Humans were competent at keeping others alive, only surpassed by their competence in harming or killing each other, but he just couldn't stop thinking of the off chance that she didn't. He was an abnormality that had torn up an unknown number of humans to wear their bodies as shells. He literally didn't have emotions. So why couldn't he stop thinking about Inko? Midoriya. Izuku paused his trip-spanning session of staring out the window to look at Shoto, who was one of the few students not chattering in a way that seemed to be giving their teacher a migraine, the heterochromatic-haired boy's expression blank as usual. You seem oddly troubled. Ida and Izuku were sitting in the back of the bus where things were more quiet, and for some reason, Izuku felt comforted by that. Regardless, he put on a smile. He'd spent a lot of time in front of a mirror to redevelop the muscle memory for smiling over the past few days, as for some reason his previous methods were no longer working, but for some reason, there was something about this one that felt dissatisfactory. Regardless, it should still suffice. What do you mean, Shoto? I'm fine. Forcing a smile only proves my point. Damn it. More time in the mirror it was. Izuku dropped the smile and just stared at his friend for a few seconds in silence. My mom's been hospitalized for the last few days. That got an actual reaction out of the normally unflappable boy, who jerked back in surprise, and also had the side effect of causing Ida to almost audibly snap his head 90 degrees in Izuku's direction midway through preparing to yell at Denki. How is that fine? Speaking from experience, Midoriya, remaining silent in times of emotional crisis is a horrible decision. Ida yelled with a look of concern as he grabbed Izuku firmly by both shoulders. Are you certain that you are mentally well enough to be participating in this event? I'm fine, really. He groaned, pushing Ida back into his seat, whispering under his breath, I may have taken a bit of white damage recently, but that's irrelevant. The two stayed silent for the rest of the trip, knowing all too well about the difficulty of opening up, but kept a close eye on Izuku regardless. It seemed less like he was bottling up, and more like he didn't even know what he was feeling. As Izuku watched the quartet of cat-themed heroes, a single thought dominated. Why did humans in this world seem to value appearance over everything else? At least the fancy outfits in the corporation were durable. Those cat costumes had way too much exposed skin to be viable in a job like heroism. Also, the young boy standing off to the side looking like he barely wanted to be associated with the two seemed pretty unique, his body language suggesting frustration and aversion. Maybe he could have a chat with him later. Now they were falling off the cliffside. That's annoying. Mandalay stretched as she walked back over to the buses and Eraserhead to have a chat about the schedule before she noticed the hero's eyes locked on the railing, almost like he was expecting something. It didn't seem like there was anything there though. With a faint boom from below, one of the students leapt all the way back up from below the cliff. Huh! She and Pixie Bob shrieked, while Eraserhead just shook his head and sighed. Do you need something, Midoriya? Just wanted to grab my stuff. The green-haired boy walked onto the bus, grabbed his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and casually leapt back off the railing. Eraserhead allowed himself a chuckle at the sight of the dumbfounded pussycats. Consider this your introduction to problem child number 1. Midoriya Izuku. Incredibly powerful and surprisingly compliant. Much later in the day, following a number of activities that really didn't stand out to Izuku, he found himself in a room with the two pussycats, overseeing a fainted Izumi Koda, who earlier that day had punched Eijiro in the groin, somehow causing more damage than any recent villain had by catching him off guard. He found himself let out a snort at that for some reason. Regarding Mandalay's explanation of Koda's past though, it was a little similar to how Inko had reacted on his first night as Izuku, both of them showing extreme reactions to the loss of their kin. Back in the corporation, the agents never reacted particularly well when he took someone as a shell, but he had never managed to truly comprehend the reasons behind some of their reactions. He understood fear as that was instinctual to all living beings, but other things were foreign to him. The reasons they shed tears over corpses, the reasons they screamed curses and charged instead of running to preserve their lives. The shell was taking damage. It's about your mother. She was hospitalized a few hours ago due to emergency health conditions. I just can't understand it. He muttered to himself silently. Koda sat on the edge of a cliff, far away from the noisy crowd of people that wanted to be heroes. Stupid, all of them, spending all afternoon showing off their quirks. Then, there was that strange one who just walked around staring at people, who was sitting next to him right now, notebook in hand, doodling away in the light of the stars. He didn't know when he'd gotten here, or how he'd found out about his secret hiding spot, but there was something weird about this one, more so than the others. Namely, when he'd randomly brought up Koda's parents after minutes on end of being completely silent. Did Mandalay tell you? He demanded, while the boy continued to stare forwards and at his sketchbook, without a concern in the world. A little. He was drawing a picture of what seemed to be a young boy, surrounded by creatures that looked like waves, the night sky behind them dotted by stars. I just wanted to ask you a few questions about it. For one, I don't see why their deaths would make you so angry towards heroes as a whole. Koda could have left at any time he wanted. He should have, with the bluntness that the topic of his parents was being approached. And yet, the boy seemed genuinely curious, there was nothing else to it. He didn't want to confront Koda's attitude, he didn't want to comfort him in ways that didn't matter, he just wanted to know what Koda's answer would be. Koda shuffled away from the boy slightly, and he didn't move even a bit, still drawing in that sketchbook. Everyone's crazy. Calling each other stupid names like hero and villains, and killing each other, talking about quirks and stuff. It's because they're all showing off that it ended up like that. The green-haired boy put some finishing touches on the sketch he had been making as he listened. Maybe it is. Koda swung his head around in disbelief. Did he just agree? But you know, it's not just quirks that cause stuff like this. He continued. I once heard a story of a city with terms like fixers, associations, offices, and syndicates, and instead of quirks, they revolved around technology. Each day was a struggle for survival. Sometimes, people would kill because they believed it was right. Other times, people would kill just because they wanted to. He shrugged his shoulders and looked over at Koda. People kill other people all the time for all sorts of different reasons, even if it weren't for quirks, heroes, and villains. Technically, a person who uses a gun to kill someone isn't a villain, by legal terms if they don't use their quirk, just a criminal. Do you think they're as crazy or stupid as the others who do? Isn't it stupid that people keep killing each other to begin with? Koda retorted. The boy just continued humming an odd tune to himself that sounded like something you'd hear in a lobby. A little. Humans could get much more done if they worked together. But there's just some things that can't be done without killing. Animals fight and kill over territory, mates, and most importantly food. Humans fight and kill for so many more reasons because they have more than just instincts. They have desires and wants, and those can't always coexist with someone else's. As long as there's two people on the planet, and they both want the same object, they'll fight each other. But we're getting off topic. You still haven't answered my question. That it's because everyone keeps saying it was a good thing. Nonsense about honorable deaths and heroic sacrifices. Koda felt tears welling behind his eyes as he flashed back to the morgue. Are they happy that my parents are dead? He felt a hand gently press on his cap and ruffle around a bit. Seems like it doesn't work when there's a hat in the way. He heard the boy mutter before clearing his voice. Logically speaking, if only your parents died to stop whoever they were fighting from killing more people, then it was a good thing. 2 deaths in place of dozens is mathematically the better outcome. But that doesn't take into account what you thought about them. Do you think your parents were bad people, Koda? Of course not. He yelled a little louder than he wanted. Then there's the reason. The boy sounded oddly satisfied. It's because you were, I think the word is closer? Yeah, you were closer with them than everyone else. That's why their deaths outweighed the lives they saved in your eyes alone, because you knew them better. A little like the manager and their favorites. Koda raised a brow at that last part, but the boy didn't elaborate. Seeing that he wouldn't get any more details on that last bit that had no context, the younger of the pair scoffed. Did you come all this way just to talk about a bunch of gloomy stuff and make me cry about my parents? No, I just wanted to understand you a bit more. I just realized I forgot to introduce myself after all that. He extended a hand to Koda with a smile, and with some lingering reluctance, the younger boy shook it. My name's Midoriya Izuku. Izumi Koda. Would you like to hear a bit about my drawings? I think we've got a bit more time before curfew. Fine. But I'm kicking you out of here after that. Midoriya Izuku was certainly a weird one among the hero students in beliefs and perspective, but Koda decided that he liked him a bit better than the others for that, as he listened to a story about a child of the galaxy who gifted pebbles with healing properties to those he loved. He didn't realize until he returned to the camp that he had missed dinner and was absolutely starving. So the reason had to do with personal experiences and opinions. Very interesting. He'd seen similar behavior from the manager before. There were certain agents that they seemed to prefer, always equipping them with the best gear they could, and keeping them out of harm's way when possible. He remembered killing an agent that the others had lauded as the manager's pet, and was instantly surrounded by the rabbit team when he had already cleaved through a good portion of the facility. It was only by that agent's death that the manager had hit the panic button. For emotions to affect humans to such a degree, such that the actions of one individual could shift another's entire worldview so long as they were close enough, it was something he would absolutely have to look into in future. And still, he didn't know why Midoriya Inko never left his mind, or how the thought that he hadn't seen her for a few days by now caused a non-physical stinging pain around where his heart was. He had only stayed with her for a few months to act as her son, and was taught how to be human by her, and had likely interacted with her more than any other human as Izuku. Izuku really couldn't understand it. Another day, another round of, did this count as stalking? If an entire class of students was out in the open practicing their quirks, with no attempts to hide said practice, was it intrusive to wander around and watch them? If Class 1B thought that was the case, the training was occupying them enough that they didn't voice any concerns. There was that blonde boy, Monoma, who tried to taunt him, but a few minutes of parroting his sentences back to him in his exact tone of voice and watching the boy grow increasingly infuriated later, their class representative clocked him unconscious and dragged him away. She'd be a pretty good candidate for Gold Rush. Midoriya Izuku, I believe? He heard an unfamiliar voice say behind him. Vlad King, pro hero, homeroom teacher of Class 1B, and most interestingly, someone he'd never properly met before. The rather large man towered over him as he walked over, quite a contrast to Eraserhead. "Your homeroom teacher has been looking for you." "All right," Izuku replied, and the two left Class 1B's area, much to the class's collective relief. Izuku's stare had felt oddly violating, but not in a lecherous way, more like how the insides of a dissected frog were looked at by a curious yet innocent student who wanted to know how they worked, and it had been throwing most of them off quite a bit. Returning to Class 1's side of things, Eraserhead was overlooking the rest of the class's training, before turning to the pair. "There you are. What have you been doing, Midoriya?" "Wandering around a bit, watching the others. Why?" "I would recommend that you find a more productive use of your time," Aizawa said with his usual dead, red-eyed stare. "I understand that you already have a firm grasp on your quirk. It's why we haven't assigned you a training exercise. I also have a faint memory of your performance at the USJ before passing out from blood loss, so I know you're still hiding part of it from us. But this training camp is for all of you to improve, so as your teacher, it's my job to make sure you learn something new from all this." "You don't have to worry about that, Aizawa-sensei," Izuku said with a wide smile before looking up at Vlad King. "I've always been learning." Vlad looked quite perturbed by the fact that Izuku, who he had spoken to a grand total of 1 time, had already managed to mimic his voice to the quality of a video recording, especially when considering that compared to other heroes, he had a somewhat low number of media appearances. "Seems like it'll take a bit more to get it right." Izuku mused. He could get more accurate? Eraserhead just sighed again. "Fine. But no matter what you're doing, always be aware of where you came from. It'll remind you of the reason you're supposed to improve, and why you keep putting in effort to do so." Where he came from? Aizawa-sensei certainly didn't have to worry about that. There wasn't a second that passed without Izuku wondering how to better mimic humans. "Blood covers the whole floor, screams echo, people are running away." Such a description was arguably an understatement compared to what was currently happening. 006-20 had escaped again, and all the agents in the facility were busy trying to locate its shell. But after so many escape attempts, nothing there had learned how to evade them. It knew the one place they wouldn't check. Clerks. Shuffling along in the crowd of panicked colleagues with low-grade firearms, nothing there made its way into one of the corporation's computer rooms, out of the manager's sight, as they would have their hands full scanning the main rooms of the facility for its shell, which had long since been disposed of among the piles of gore left around its containment cell. All it had to do was block the cameras with viscera, and it was home free. Looking around, the abnormality watched the clerks slowly calm themselves, waiting for the agents outside to complete their suppression tasks. That did beg the question of what the manager would do once they realized nothing there was nowhere to be found. Would they execute every agent with those execution bullets they used to keep the queen in check? Or was there a protocol that none of the agents passing by had ever mentioned? Whatever the result was, nothing there would be able to learn, and that was all that mattered to it. Suddenly, the world began to warp around the abnormality, reality growing hazy and distorting, the shiny red halls of the disciplinary department giving way to a more rustic gray. Suddenly, it wasn't in a small, cramped room with terrified clerks anymore. Instead, it was in some sort of large, open chamber, the most notable human around being one man in a suit. Really? That's all that the quirk could summon? An ordinary human. The man grumbled, pointing his hand at the shell. Useless. Spike-like tendrils erupted from his fingers, plunging into the shell, and finding resistance against the body of nothing there housed inside. Oh! The shell was damaged, and its identity compromised, which meant it was useless. Tearing out the back of the clerk's body, nothing there snarled and broke the tendrils with a swipe. The other humans in the area started to panic and flee, while the man watched with what seemed to be intrigue. That's more like it. But this still isn't enough to fight the inheritors of my brother's quirk. His arm mutated to defend against a lunge from nothing there, its claws ripping deep but not deep enough into his enlarged forearm, and with a swipe, he sent the abnormality flying through a wall. It seemed like it would take some more effort to procure this one as a shell. When the dust settled, what sat there in the beast's place was a cocoon constructed from muscle. The boogeyman of hero society, all for one, was suddenly overcome by a feeling of dread, his intuition that had guided him so far yelling for him to run. But that couldn't be right. Just what could possibly be so bad about that Koku? Hello. Before he could so much as blink, his heart had been reduced to a splatter on the wall at the opposite end of the massive storage room by the rib-sized projectile that had torn through his chest. A humanoid limb had emerged from the cocoon, and the rest of the thing that he had summoned tore itself free soon after. Bony spikes protruded from random parts of its body, as did blinking eyes. There was a blue-clawed arm sticking out of its head, just above an all-too-wide mouth. All for one fell to the ground with a gasp, clutching his grievous wound as his regeneration quirks kicked into overdrive to keep him alive, knitting the wound shut as quickly as they could as the being stepped towards him, one deliberate step at a time. Help! Someone help! It spouted meaninglessly, slamming down its mace-like hand onto where all for one had been a mere moment ago, the demon lord to be throwing himself out of harm's way as his heart regenerated enough for him to not die in the next few seconds. He channeled as many strengthening quirks as he could into his arm, uncaring of how grotesquely it bulked up and swelled in size. This thing was too dangerous to be used as an asset. He swung forwards, intent on crushing the thing where it stood. Goodbye! Its arm sharpened into a massive, gleaming blade, and cut clean through his arm without any resistance. Despite the massive number of quirks he had poured into it, the mutated muscles and flesh crashed to the floor beside him, and perhaps what put him off the most was how the beast just stood there, each eye locked onto his body like it was studying him. If it really wanted him dead, it would have directed that devastating blow to his body, but instead, it had just taken his arm. It wanted to watch him squirm. All for one flung his intact arm forwards, and with a combination of every quirk he could still muster, he forced the floor to collapse, taking the being with it as it fell deeper into the compound below. The villain immediately began to make his escape while making arrangements for the compound to self-destruct. It was full of valuable assets he had intended to use against the wielders of One for All, far too many to evacuate, but if it meant he could get far away from that abomination, then it was fine. How had it gone so wrong? All he had wanted to do was test a rather interesting quirk, simply named Summon, capable of pulling objects that shouldn't exist from what appeared to be other realities, and limited by the toll it put on its user. He had stolen the quirk, and in the hopes of finding something to strengthen his forces, allowed the quirk to run wild with his immense power fueling it. It should have been obvious that something from another world would be an uncontrollable variable, something he despised, yet he'd gone and pulled in a beast that was a threat to himself into this world. Now, all he could do was hope that that killing machine went in the direction of his enemies. Hooked up to a myriad of life-preserving devices, all for one couldn't help but sigh at that old memory. How foolish he had been back then, to think that he could control everything in a sea of infinite possibilities. He dove in head first and got bitten by a shark for his hubris, to say nothing of what could possibly lie even deeper. He hadn't used Summon ever since. It was too dangerous, too unpredictable for even him to consider. He could have accidentally summoned something capable of razing the entirety of Japan to the ground, leaving him with nothing to rule over even if he somehow survived, or worse, a hero from another world that would ensure the downfall of villainy. Still, the return of that monster was a source of numerous headaches for him. He had acquired more quirks in the decades since then, but was also far weaker thanks to the efforts of that brutish oaf All Might. In his current state, it could probably tear him in half like a napkin, and Tamura would have his hand cut off long before he could even try to lay a finger on it, even with Kurogyri's aid, meaning he didn't have any good answers to one of the few things to ever make him feel fear. Hopefully, with the massive area that Yue's training camp occupied, Tamura would be able to avoid encountering and being slaughtered by Izuku, while also accomplishing the missions he'd set for the League. Come to think of it, did Tamura inform his new subordinates about their policy around avoiding Midoriya Izuku? And if he did he make sure that they knew who Midoriya Izuku was? It should be fine, right? During the test of courage, Izuku and Momo wandered deeper into the forest to find a suitable spot along the assigned path for their scare. Do you have anything in mind, Midoriya? Momo asked. Izuku turned to her with a look of curiosity. Why were you asking me? Because you've always been experienced in causing fear. Alright, fair enough. He shrugged as he flipped through his notebook before handing it over to his classmate. I need you to make a costume, just the shell, I'll handle the rest. The rich girl's eyes flitted over the design, growing wider and wider as she comprehended what she was being asked to make, and let out a nervous laugh. Class 1B, I am so very sorry. A couple minutes later, Ragdoll and Mandalay were walking through the forest trail in search of a number of students who hadn't returned, both from classes 1A and 1B. According to Ragdoll's quirk, they were all in the same area and not moving for some reason, despite the activity having ended a bit ago. Kids, the game's OV dash. The sound of faint slobbering and chewing could be heard in the silence of the night, and the two heroes felt their blood run cold as their legs pumped faster. There shouldn't have been any wild animals in the area. Were the children in danger? As they approached the mass of blips that Ragdoll had located, they found dozens of UA students strewn about, some dangling from trees, some lodged halfway into bushes, and some just lying on the ground, all of them unconscious and thankfully unharmed. The sounds came from somewhere deeper in the forest, behind a set of rustling bushes, and Mandalay slowly pushed the leaves apart as they approached to see some sort of black ball. At first, they didn't know what they were looking at. Then, they registered the blank, mask-like faces that lined the ball's sides. Then, they noticed that it was raised up on two legs. Then, they realized it was moving and making the gross noises they'd been hearing with its massive mouth. Finally, they noticed the body of Momo lying in front of the thing, blank-eyed with stains of red surrounding her mouth as the being continued to make chewing sounds as it lurked over her. The heroes froze as the thing paused and made a sniffing sound, before turning around and looking directly at them. Its mouth took up almost all of its spherical body, like an ancient game from the pre-Quark era about a yellow sphere that ate things. Its jagged, massive teeth and entire region surrounding its mouth dyed red instead of the black its flesh was, as something fleshy vanished past its jaws. Where it was facing, Momo's uniform was torn and an indiscernible pile of red in the dark of the forest. The monster looked at the petrified heroes and let out a horrific scream. They fainted immediately. Whoops. Those weren't students. Izuku muttered as he emerged from his costume, the meatball-like shape of the mountain of smiling bodies falling apart in two halves like an egg. Behind him, Momo sat up and grimaced as she noticed the unconscious teachers. Like I said, you're a little too good at this. Momo said with a shudder as she made a piece of tissue to clean the red paint she had slathered on herself to look wounded. She had known everything, and yet the way that Izuku acted and sounded was far too realistic. It felt like she was actually about to have her entrails feasted on by a walking meatball. Did you have to put the other students all over the place? It added to the authenticity. Izuku defended as he picked up the many fainted bodies in the area by turning both his hands into tendrils. We should get back. If they came looking for people, that means the test is probably over. The two started making their way out of the forest, carrying about a dozen other people, before a question came to Momo's mind that had been somewhat bugging her. How'd you get out of the costume so fast? I have experience in removing shells quickly. Izuku was promptly banned from participating in any horror-related event in future as to avoid traumatizing unsuspecting guests and fellow students. Himiko Toga giggled to herself as she quietly stalked the pair of girls she had set her eyes on, Uraraka and Azui. She'd had them on her mind for weeks now, and with the lovely blood skin device she'd been given, she'd get to know them much better soon. The serial killer raised her knife and prepared to lunge. What are you doing? Someone asked behind her. The girl whipped around to see a certain green-haired boy. It was Midoriya Izuku. Admittedly, she wasn't really interested in him, since he was kinda flat in personality on TV. Also, her boss said to avoid him. But he was right there, so his blood was as good as any. The needle of her blood drainer was jabbed forwards at Midoriya's chest, only for it to snap in half upon contact. Toga pulled back the tool and stared at it in disappointment, and the two just stood there for a while. I was going to SCK out your blood, but that won't work now. Toga sighed, before looking up with pleading eyes. Can you let me cut you at least? No, Toga pouted, before Izuku stretched out his arm, and a leathery bulb emerged from it like a fruit. Knives are inefficient. Toga salivated as it slowly inflated with blood. What do you need it for anyways? Because I love blood. Toga giggled. It's tasty and, well, quirk stuff I can't say too much. The blonde sniffed the air a bit, before looking at Izuku with newfound intrigue. Now that I think about it, you've got a funny smell. Izuku just blinked as he detached the bulb from his arm, pinching the end of the newly formed blood-filled water skin. What kind of smell? The kind where you want to be like someone else. The way I smell. She leaned in closer. But you're different. Richer and stronger, but less sharp. I don't think I can smell that. Might be a quirk thing. Maybe. Toga laughed as she gladly took the biological bag of blood. I've never gotten this much blood before. I think I'll have a little taste. She took a greedy sip from the water skin and felt her quirk start to work, covering her with gray slime, before it stuttered, as if her quirk had encountered an odd roadblock. She felt the second layer over her body starting to become uneven, lopsided, and misshapen, before the slime cleared from her eyes, and she looked down to see the weirdest result she'd ever gotten from transform. Her limbs were different lengths, her skin different colors and mismatched like Frankenstein's monster. Huh. Even the voice that came out of her mouth was a mix of different people's. What's this? Ah. Izuku's eyes moved over her misshapen form. Destiny. Maxwell. Adam. Tatiana. He said as he laid eyes on each individual portion. Galena. Lamarcus. It seems I should have given you some purer blood. As Toga called off the effects of her quirk, letting the mutated mimicry she'd made melt away, she grabbed Izuku by the collars of his shirt excitedly. You really are like me, aren't you? If you're talking about mimicry, then yes, I guess I am. Finally. Toga cheered, before borderline pouncing on him. What's your favorite part? Mine's that rush at the end when I get to really be them, more than just wearing the same clothes and stuff. My favorite part, I guess it's the learning. Izuku replied, before speaking in Toga's voice. Getting to understand them bit by bit. It helps pass the time, and it's good practice that carries over every time I fail. Every time, huh? So you've done this before? A couple times. Keep it a secret, will you? He raised a finger that was sharpening into a blade, dripping with it. Concerningly neon blue substance. I'll paralyze you if you don't. Toga playfully mimicked zipping her mouth shut. No problem. You should teach me how to be a better mimic if we meet again. I'll consider it. Izuku handed over the new water skin, and Toga gave it another sip, turning into a proper copy of Izuku this time, before turning back with a pleased expression. You should get going soon. It's not fun to be caught and locked in a room when you still want to mimic people. Speaking from experience again? Too much. Toga laughed. You're my new favorite person. Oh, and one more thing. Izuku's arm lashed out, scratching a set of short lines across Toga's cheek. The girl's bright demeanor went to bewilderment in an instant as the boy moved faster than she could react, and that only grew as she felt the scratches open up. Then, she proceeded to gasp as she suddenly gained 3 more perspectives. She looked in the reflection of her knife to see a number of eyes lining her cheek, and newfound strength filled her somewhat frail body. Izuku looked rather pleased by his handiwork. A gift from one mimic to another. Well, guess I'll see you in Fut Dash. The boy's parting words were cut off as he was sealed into a gleaming marble. Himiko. Toga looked up to see one of her comrades, Mr. Compress, leap down from a tree branch. Are you all right? All right. The girl giggled as she ran her hand over the EGO gift. This is the happiest day of my life. Well, Compress honestly didn't know if he should touch this topic anytime soon. Accidentally making insensitive comments was the easiest way for a performer to end their career, after all. So, he went for the simplest option, flashing her a theatrical thumbs up. Good for you. Anyways, we have to go. Mustard, Moonfish, and Muscular have been defeated. Okay. The magician picked up the marble containing Toga's new best friend, and she hummed a tune to herself as they went to the rendezvous point. Today was a good day. Good you're back. Shigaraki drawled as the Vanguard Action Squad filtered out of Kurojire's portal and into the bar. They were down a few members, but that was fine. Those three were rather disposable anyways, especially Muscular. Did you get who we wanted? Unfortunately, I was not able to capture Katsuki Bakugo. Mr. Compress lamented, only to throw his hands up in alarm as Tamura's fingers twitched with agitation. But I did capture a student. Bring them out then. The hand-masked boy snarled, and a marble rolled to the floor, revealing Midoriya Izuku. Tamura was pinned to the wall by a sharp pain in his shoulder before he could process the enormity of the Vanguard Squad's F-up. Hello again, Tamura. Izuku stood up and patted himself off, completely unconcerned by the fact he was in a villain lair. To make matters worse, he was the most dangerous person present. You idiots! Shigaraki shrieked at the increasingly concerned villains, who aside from Toga, were slowly making distance from Izuku. I specifically told you to avoid him. You said, green-haired boy, and nothing else. Compress retorted, while Dabi nodded in agreement, and Spinner, Twice and Magna creeped over to the door. It was dark, we were in a forest, and we were on a timer. It's not easy to make out green in those conditions. Kurojire, get him out. Izuku glanced at Kurojire, who had raised a hand. Open a portal and I'll take his head off. The bartender was greatly conflicted, because it looked a bit like he was going to do that anyways, but decided not to test his luck and get Tamura killed, slowly lowering his arm. I've had a few questions I wanted to ask you for a while, but I should probably ask the most important one first. Izuku walked up closer to Tamura, but not within grasping range. Who do you work for? Clearly, you heard about me from someone. Shigaraki hissed in defiance. I'll never tell Dash. The TV of the bar crackled to life. That would be me. Izuku turned towards the TV with a look of intrigue. Oh, it's you. It's been a while, hasn't it? Yes, it certainly has. Not long enough, it seems. Tamura gulped as even he noticed an undertone of concern in his sensei's voice. So, where are you? Izuku stepped towards the TV, as if he was able to see all for one through the inactive screen. I didn't get the chance to learn about you last time, so I wouldn't mind meeting you again. Besides, you were the one who brought me here. You should take some responsibility. All for one let out a strained laugh. Responsibility, you say? I'm afraid I'll have to refuse. Seeing an opening, Kurojire opened a portal as fast as he could, dropping Izuku through it while he was distracted talking to his master. The boy shot him a look of annoyance as he fell through, and multiple sighs of relief could be heard from around the room. Where'd you send him? Tamura asked as Kurojire got some medical equipment to pull out whatever was pinning him to the wall. Back to the forest camp. Before Tamura could start yelling again about things like why he didn't teleport Izuku halfway across the world, All for One spoke up. A good choice, Kurojire. It's better if we know where he is before he can switch to another body. The bar was silent for a bit, before Dabi, the most ballsy one present, decided to ask a question. Does this mean we did all that for nothing? The next day, the villains would find that it hadn't been for nothing, though actually receiving a pizza for their efforts would have been preferable. Izuku found himself falling and falling and falling until his back hit a grassy forest floor, and he found a number of his classmates and Class 1B students staring at him in absolute and utter confusion. Hi guys. I'm back, he said nonchalantly. Eraserhead just groaned like his soul was leaving his body while the other students were completely stunned. Where were you, Midoriya? Visiting a brief acquaintance. That I'm not going to ask right now. A lot had changed in just a few days. Following All Might's fight against All for One, UA established the Heights Alliance, a dormitory for UA students to reside in that would protect them against villains in future by allowing them to be on campus at all times. From what he'd heard, everyone else had accepted and moved in already. In his case, with Inko still in the hospital with no signs of her condition improving, Izuku was placed into the dorms by default. Standing in front of the grand entrance, Izuku couldn't help but feel a sense of hesitation, as if his legs were refusing. The orders to move. Why was that? Brushing aside the odd sensation, and burying it in the pile of other weird things he had been feeling over the course of the last few weeks, he went through the doors and went straight to his room. He could talk to his classmates later. What he wanted to see was if they'd gone through with his room request, and they had. It was quite funny to imagine the argument that the teachers must have had when he sent them the layout request. Izuku's room was a sterile, white and gray chamber, with nothing but a bed inside behind a wall and floor-spanning line of hazard colors. A number of metallic devices, apparatuses and pipes lined the walls as decorations, and most notable was the number 27 in thick, bold black. It looked nothing like a room for a growing boy. Izuku liked it this way. He'd been locked up in Lobotomy Corporation for most of his life, and the containment units were the closest thing to a home he'd ever had. With the ability to leave any time he wanted without setting off an ear-splitting second trumpet, he was perfectly fine with living in one again. Judging by the gasp he heard from the door, his classmates didn't agree. "Mina, if you're going to spy on me or other people in future, you should learn to stay quiet," he said as he turned to the door to see a number of 1A students staring in disbelief and even more concerned than when he was kidnapped. They muttered apologies and immediately left, deciding to keep the very concerning can of worms shut. He was then excluded from their best taste competition. For some reason that stung a little. A concept that Izuku had only truly experienced since coming to this world. All he knew was that it was the time that non-nocturnal animals went to sleep and exhausted employees went home in order to prepare for the next day. It was rather soothing, to be honest. The sound of firm but aggressive footsteps coming from behind certainly weren't though. It seemed that Bakugo was up. He still didn't have an answer to how to fool him, but since the blonde hadn't done anything, he was probably in the CLE. An explosion suddenly hit him in the back, knocking him, and the chair he was sitting on, over. Katsuki! What are you doing? Ida rushed over in an instant to apprehend the suddenly attacking blonde, who struggled against being restrained. "Get off me!" he snarled. "I've had enough of him. I understand that you may be aggravated by the recent villain attacks, but that is no reason to assault Izuku. He's not Izuku, dumbass." Correction, it seems that some damage control was necessary. Izuku picked himself up and dusted himself off as the rest of 1A fell silent at the blonde's blunt declaration. Maybe he could get them to write this off as a misunderstanding. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Katsuki Kaken." Izuku froze as the blonde glared at him with fire in his eyes. "That's what you used to call me. You never stopped either. And yet you haven't even said that once." He tore himself free from Ida's increasingly slack grasp and strode towards Izuku. Izuku! Another explosion hit the green-haired boy, who stood there silently, gently tossed about by the blasts. "I don't care if you're that transforming villain on the news, or like that slime fucker from before, but you're not the quirkless nerd I grew up with. You're not that idiot who wouldn't shut up about becoming a hero with those notebooks full of analyzed quirk." Bakugo stood over Izuku, who was immobile and on his knees, head dipped down in silence. "And that means you don't belong here." So, the jig was up. Logically speaking, what he should do was the same as always. With his disguise revealed, the best option would be to kill all the witnesses and find a new shell to continue walking among the humans with. And yet he couldn't. He couldn't raise his hand to tear apart 4 students at once with a well-placed shot. He couldn't bring himself to tear his way out of the shell that was Midoriya Izuku. That must have been it. Being a human for so long had broken him. "Yeah, you're right." Izuku stood up, causing Bakugo to back off warily. "I never thought otherwise, but I really couldn't be anything else, could I? No matter how much I learned." 006-20, nothing there. His voice changed to that same tone he'd used during their first heroics lesson, the scratchy speaker recording. An abnormality whose appearance resembles a human, but cannot and should not be human. Izuku let out what sounded like a forced laugh. "I really did enjoy our time together. And I promised Inko that I'd make his dream a reality. But it always ends up the same way, doesn't it? The humans lock the monster up and leave happily ever after." Smoke began to billow out from Izuku's feet, quickly engulfing the entire room, and soon the building and the 1A students cried out in alarm. I suppose that's it then. Goodbye, everyone. Nisa's office went red with alarms as the entirety of 1A's dorm detected anomalies, a camera showing him that the dorm was being covered by a strange smoke. Damn it, Bakugo, this is why they didn't tell him about Midoriya's real identity. He immediately reached for the microphone to tell every teacher on campus to make their way there, but paused as something odd came onto the cameras that should have been inside the dorms. What am I looking at? When the smoke cleared, the students found themselves in the middle of an alleyway between two skyscrapers, with rain pouring down yet not drenching anyone. Suddenly, Aizawa-sensei came through the fog, his capture scarf ready. Is everyone alright? That fucker won't be once I'm done with him. Bakugo yelled, looking around violently with his hands outstretched. If he thinks he can send us somewhere like this, he's got another thing. A wet, heavy splat sound cut the blonde off, and he instantly whipped around to face it, before his eyes realized what he was looking at, and he fell back holding his hand to his mouth. The rest of 1A had similar reactions, whether that be disgust or horror. Midoriya Izuku lay there, mangled and broken. That I should have said goodbye to Mom, the boy muttered weakly. Eraserhead was the first to move, lunging at the nearly dead boy in an attempt to help him, but found himself blocked by an invisible force. Hello. Something said from the sewer grate nearby. The hero and hero students were forced to watch the real Midoriya Izuku as he died on the pavement right before their very eyes, his last moments spent conversing with whatever they'd been having classes with for the last months. The second the words, "swan dive," made it past Izuku's lips, Bakugo desperately ran into the smoke, a hand cupped over his mouth. He merely came back from a different direction, and soon hurled up his lunch. Thank you for listening. With that, Izuku's eyes went blank and the sewer grate popped out, revealing a bright light in the hole that could fit a human. With great uneasiness, they descended into the hole, as there was nowhere else to go. Where the hell are we? Ijiro asked as the scenery changed once more into something outlandish. It was some sort of facility, the walls a pale yellow, and dozens of people in various outfits walked around without batting an eye at the group that had materialized out of thin air. Lobotomy Corporation? He heard Tokoyami mutter from behind him, and the bird-headed boy immediately jumped back as every student started trying to pry an answer out of him with their gazes. I merely saw it in Izuku's notebook. Attention! Nisa's voice suddenly blared from over the speakers. Class 1, can you hear me? Yes. Eraserhead replied. I won't rush you, Nizu, but if you can still contact us, you need to find us an exit, now. That'll be a little difficult. The mouse, in a great deviation from his normal character, nervously laughed. The entirety of the dormitory has been changed into this Lobotomy Corporation, and for some reason, my computers have a dozen new files and are calling me manager. There's no sign of Azu, or should I say nothing there either. Eraserhead muttered curses, while something caught Mina's attention as the pink-skinned girl wandered over to a door and tapped it, before jumping back with a yelp as it opened with a hiss, revealing some sort of floating skull on a cross. Ashido, you should be very thankful that you didn't make a mistake with that rash action. Nizu said cautiously. From what I'm reading, your task is to interact with that thing called an abnormality. Thankfully, this one is regarded as a minimal-level threat. Simply talking with it will count as work. Doing so apparently raises a bar to a Clippeth meltdown level, and I have been assigned a mission to raise the level. This may be your only means of escape. Aizawa, you and the students will have to interact with more abnormalities throughout the facility. I'll continue to provide information where I can. Well, that was convoluted. As the students split up to work with the other abnormalities, a single, unspoken cause for concern was shared between them. Was the Izuku they knew among these things? And if he was, what should they do?